Berlin smoldered under a leaden sky as Colonel Frank Steele watched the parade of victors wind through the bombed-out streets. Allied forces marched in perfect formation, their boots thundering in unison on cobblestones still scarred by artillery fire. At 58, Steele stood ramrod straight, despite the phantom pain in his right shoulder, a souvenir from the hedgerows of Normandy. His weathered face, carved by years of war and command, remained impassive as he observed the spectacle from a reviewing stand erected hastily in front of the ruined Reichstag. Tanks rolled by, one after another, American Shermans, nimble and reliable, followed by the British Comets with their improved firepower. Steele had commanded a Sherman during the push across Europe. 7 confirmed Tiger kills made him one of the most successful tank commanders in the European theater, earning him the nickname Thunder from his men. The sight of these machines stirred memories both triumphant and haunting. The faces of young men who had served under him, who had died under his command, flashed through his mind with each passing vehicle. The crowd's reaction shifted suddenly. A murmur rippled through the assembly of officers. Steele leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as a new silhouette appeared in the distance. Soviet's 3 heavy tanks entered the square, their massive hulls and sloped armor unlike anything the Western Allies had fielded. The 122mm gun jutting from the turret dwarfed the weaponry on American tanks. Steele's jaw tightened as he calculated angles, penetration capabilities, effective ranges. The strategic implications were immediate and troubling. "Quite the beast they've brought to the party," remarked General Patton, standing beside Steele. The famous commander chewed thoughtfully on a toothpick. That gun could punch through a Sherman at 2,000 yards. Steele nodded, his expression grim. And that frontal armor, our rounds would bounce off like rain. As the parade concluded, Steele found himself transported back to the Ardennes, to his final battle, December 1904 near Bastogne. His tank platoon had been supporting an infantry company when they encountered a German heavy tank battalion. Snow falling, visibility poor, a desperate situation. The Sherman rocked violently as a high-velocity round struck its flank. Warning shouts, the acrid smell of burning electronics. Johnson, his gunner, slumped forward, dead instantly. Rodriguez, loader, screaming as flames engulfed his lower body. Steele dragging Martinez, his driver, from the burning wreck. The young man's eyes glazed with shock, blood pooling beneath him on the snow. And Steele returning to the inferno to retrieve Sergeant Collins, his friend of 15 years, only to find him already gone. Yet despite the losses, Steele had managed to position his remaining vehicles to ambush the German advance. 3 Tigers destroyed, the infantry company saved. The cost had been half his men, burned and broken in metal coffins. A victory written in blood. Champagne flowed freely at the reception that evening. Military brass from all Allied nations mingled in the grand ballroom of a requisitioned hotel. Medals glinted under crystal chandeliers. Steele stood apart, nursing a glass of bourbon, his thoughts distant. A heavy hand landed on his shoulder. "Colonel Frank Steele, the famous Thunder. Your reputation precedes you." The voice carried a thick Russian accent. Steele turned to face a Soviet officer, tall and broad-shouldered, with steel gray eyes and a face crossed with a scar running from temple to jaw. "Colonel Mikhail Grachev," the man introduced himself. "I commanded a T-34 battalion during the push to Berlin." Steele's blood ran cold as recognition dawned. Intelligence reports, photographs shared during joint operations planning. This was the man whose forces had been involved in the battle for the Spree River crossing, where Steele's closest friend, Colonel David Harris, had been killed when his command post was overrun. "Your tactics at Remagen were impressive," Grachev continued, seemingly oblivious to Steele's discomfort. "Though your Sherman tanks are like children's toys compared to our new designs." Steele measured his response carefully. "American engineering focuses on reliability and production efficiency. Our tanks may lack the firepower of yours, but they never break down in the field." Grachev's laugh was cold, perfunctory. "A reliable coffin is still a coffin, Colonel." He leaned closer, vodka heavy on his breath. "The real war is just beginning. Your capitalist tanks against our communist might. Next time, there will be no joint victory parades." Steele's hand tightened around his glass. "There doesn't have to be a next time, Colonel. There is always a next time, American." Grachev's voice dropped to a whisper. "The true war has only just begun, and this time we will field machines your tanks cannot possibly oppose." The Soviet officer raised his glass in a mock toast before disappearing into the crowd, leaving Steele with a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The world had changed today. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was already fracturing, and a new kind of conflict loomed on the horizon, one where American armor would be outmatched and outgunned. Steele drained his bourbon, the weight of future wars settling on shoulders already burdened by the ghosts of the past. Chapter 2, Vienna Hung Jae, 1950. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows at Fort Knox, Kentucky, casting long shadows across the classroom floor. Frank Steele moved deliberately between rows of desks, observing young officer candidates as they sketched tank formations on maps. 5 years into peacetime, Steele had found his place as an instructor at the armored school, passing decades of hard-won knowledge to a new generation. Gentlemen, his voice commanded attention without raising volume, your textbook solutions look impressive on paper. But remember, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. A student had raised his hand. Sir, wouldn't air power make these ground maneuvers obsolete in a modern conflict? Steele smiled thinly. The question revealed the shifting military doctrine of this new era. Lieutenant Evans, strategic bombing has its place, but wars are won by boots and treads on the ground. A tank can take and hold territory. A plane can only visit it briefly. Class dismissed, Steele gathered his materials as young men filed out. His office waited down the hallway, a modest space adorned with mementos from his career. A framed photograph of his tank crew from '44, most now buried in military cemeteries across Europe. A damaged German tank commander's scope, retrieved from a destroyed Panther. A silver star in a shadow box, awarded for actions during the Battle of the Bulge. The radio murmured in the background, bringing news of a world growing increasingly complicated. Tensions with the Soviet Union escalated daily. The Berlin airlift had concluded the previous year, but the division of Germany remained a festering wound in Europe. And now reports from a place called Korea dominated headlines. A communist invasion from the north, United Nations forces mobilizing in response. Steele settled into his desk chair, wincing at the stiffness in his back. At 53, the physical toll of years commanding tanks had calcified into permanent discomfort. His hand reached automatically for the framed photograph on his desk. Catherine in her nurse's uniform, her smile radiant despite the backdrop of a field hospital in France. They had met during his recovery from wounds sustained at Normandy. She had been the one to tell him he could return to duty, understanding without words that he needed to rejoin his men. After the war, they had married and settled near Fort Knox. She understood him like no one else, having seen the same horrors from her side of the conflict, holding dying boys as they called for their mothers. His eyes drifted to another photograph. William, their son, in his West Point uniform, 21 years old, class of 1951, following in his father's footsteps but with ambitions toward the emerging field of armor design rather than combat command. A source of both pride and concern. The boy had his mother's intellect and his father's stubbornness, a combination that frequently led to tension between them. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," Steele called, straightening in his chair. The door opened to reveal an orderly. "Colonel Steele, sir, General Abrams requests your presence at headquarters immediately." Steele felt a flicker of surprise. General Robert Abrams commanded the armored forces at Fort Knox, a hard-driving officer who had distinguished himself during the war. A summons from him was unusual. "Thank you, Corporal. Tell the General I'm on my way." Headquarters occupied an imposing brick building at the center of the base. Steele climbed the steps with measured pace, nodding to junior officers who saluted as he passed. The general's aide, Captain Simmons, ushered him directly into Abrams' office. Robert Abrams stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the training grounds where new recruits learned to operate the M26 Pershing tanks that had arrived too late to see widespread action in World War II. He turned as Steele entered, revealing a face hardened by command but enlivened by intelligent eyes. "Frank," he greeted without ceremony. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "General?" Steele nodded respectfully. They had served together in Europe, sharing the blood and mud of combat, creating a bond that transcended rank. "Have a seat." Abrams gestured to a chair before his desk. "Bourbon?" Steele shook his head. "Not during duty hours, sir." Abrams chuckled. "Always the professional." He settled into his own chair, sliding a folder across the desk. "Frank, what do you know about the current situation in Korea?" "Only what's in the papers, sir. North Korean forces push south across the 38th parallel. Seoul has fallen. Our troops are being rushed in from Japan. And what they're facing, Abrams tapped the folder, is something our boys aren't prepared for. Steele opened the file, finding reconnaissance photographs of Soviet-built T-34-85 tanks, the same models that had spearheaded the Red Army's drive to Berlin. 32 tons of sloped armor with an 85mm high-velocity gun. Our initial forces deployed with M24 Chaffies, Abrams continued. Light tanks with 75mm guns, completely outmatched. We're rushing Pershings to the theater, but early engagements have been, he paused, costly. Steele studied the photographs, mind-calculating angles of attack, vulnerable points, effective combat ranges. The Pershing can handle a T-34, sir, tight match, but our gun has the edge. Yes, Abrams nodded, but that's not what concerns intelligence. He produced another folder, this one stamped with top secret in bold red letters. This arrived yesterday from the Pentagon. Inside was a grainy photograph taken at a Russian military parade in Moscow. Steele recognized the vehicle immediately. The IS-3, the same tank that had shocked Western observers at the Berlin Victory Parade. But this time, the image included technical specifications obtained by intelligence sources. They're sending these to Korea? Steele asked, voice tight with concern. Abrams' expression darkened. We have credible intelligence that shipments are already en route. If these deploy in numbers, Frank, our boys are in serious trouble. The IS-3's frontal armor is nearly impenetrable to our current tank guns, even the 90mm on the Pershing. Steele closed the folder. The implications clear. American tanks would be outgunned and out-armored in a direct confrontation. It would be a slaughter reminiscent of the early days against German Panthers and Tigers, when American crews had learned the hard way that their Shermans were outclassed. What are we doing about it? Abrams leaned forward. That's why I called you here, Frank. The Pentagon has authorized an emergency development program. We need a tank that can go toe-to-toe with the IS-3, and we need it yesterday. The M46 is just entering service, Steele countered, and the T-42 design is years from production. We don't have years, Abrams stood, pacing the office. We need an interim solution, something that can be fielded within 18 months using existing chassis and components, a heavy gun on a proven platform. Understanding dawned on Steele. You're talking about another Firefly situation. During the war, the British had mounted their powerful 17-pounder gun on Sherman tanks, creating the Firefly variant that could effectively engage German Panthers and Tigers. Exactly, Abrams nodded, but this time with a 120mm gun on an American platform. We're calling it Project Thunderbolt. The name sent an involuntary shiver down Steele's spine. Thunder had been his wartime call sign. Coincidence, surely. Why are you telling me this, General? Abrams returned to his desk, his expression serious. Because you're being recalled to active service, Frank, effective immediately. The Secretary of the Army has personally requested you to lead the development team. Steele felt the room still around him. With respect, sir, I'm an instructor now. A tank commander, not an engineer. You're exactly what this project needs, Abrams insisted. You've faced superior enemy tanks and found ways to beat them. You know what works in actual combat, not just on paper. The engineers can handle the technical aspects. We need your practical experience to ensure this weapon system is effective in the field. Steele thought of his classroom, of Catherine, of the life they had built here. I've already given my war years to the Army, Bob. Abrams' voice softened. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't vital. Those boys in Korea are facing Russian steel with inferior weapons. Just like we did in 4, he paused, allowing the memory to resonate. Only this time we have a chance to get ahead of the problem. The faces of Steele's lost crew members flashed through his mind. Young men in burning tanks, sacrificed because American industry had prioritized quantity over quality. How many more would die in Korea facing Soviet armor that could destroy them before they got within effective firing range? Where would this project be based? Steele asked finally. Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. You'd head a special development team with complete access to resources and testing facilities. Steele stood, moving to the window. Outside, young tankers climbed aboard their machines, unaware that across the world, their counterparts faced weapons that could render all their training moot. When do I start? Abrams smiled grimly. Your orders are already cut. Transport leaves tomorrow morning. That evening, Frank Steele sat on the porch of his modest home, watching the sunset paint the Kentucky sky in hues of orange and purple. Catherine settled beside him, her hand finding his with practiced familiarity. You're leaving? She said simply. not a question. Korea, Steele confirmed, then amended, well, not directly, Maryland, project development. Catherine nodded, understanding immediately. A nurse who had served in field hospitals, she knew better than most what was at stake. They need tanks that can fight whatever the Russians are sending. Yes. How long? 18 months, if we're lucky. Her hand tightened on his. Will you write to William? He should hear this from you, not through Army channels. Their son, nearly graduated from West Point, his future bright with promise. Their relationship had grown strained in recent years, the boy challenging his father's outdated perspectives on warfare. William believed in a future of air power and missiles, viewing tanks as increasingly obsolete. I'll write him tonight, Steele promised, though the prospect of explaining this new assignment to his skeptical son filled him with uncharacteristic uncertainty. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness claimed the sky, two people who had witnessed humanity at its worst, yet still found reasons to hope for better. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a new mission, the weight of responsibilities that could mean life or death for young Americans halfway around the world. Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder. They're lucky to have you, Frank. Steele wasn't so certain, but he knew his duty, and as the stars emerged above Fort Knox, Colonel Frank "Thunder" Steele prepared himself once again for war, even if this time his battlefield would be testing grounds and conference rooms rather than the blood-soaked fields of Europe. Chapter 2, WWII Thunderbolt, 1950-1951. Aberdeen Proving Ground sprawled across the Maryland landscape like a city dedicated to the science of warfare. Tank firing ranges stretched to the horizon, workshops hummed with machinery, experimental vehicles traversed obstacle courses designed to push metal and mechanics to breaking points. Amid this martial industry, a secluded facility housed Project Thunderbolt. Colonel Frank Steele's footsteps echoed on concrete floors as Major General William Porter, commanding officer of Aberdeen, led him through the compound. A security checkpoint marked the entrance to a warehouse complex surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. The Joint Chiefs have authorized extraordinary measures for this project, Porter explained, his voice reverberating in the cavernous space. Complete secrecy, unlimited testing resources, priority materials allocation. Steele surveyed the facility. Multiple M46 Patton tanks stood in various states of disassembly. Engineers clustered around blueprints spread across makeshift tables. Welding torches sparked in the distance. The air hung heavy with the scent of grease, metal, and purpose. 18 months, Steele remarked, to design, test, and field a completely new heavy tank. Porter's expression tightened. The timetable is aggressive, I grant you, but intelligence estimates that IS-3 tanks could begin deployment to Chinese forces within 6 months. If they reach the Korean front in numbers, he left the sentence unfinished. Both men understood the potential consequences. American troops with inadequate armor would pay the price in blood. Your team has been assembled from across the services, Porter continued, approaching a conference room where several figures waited. The best minds we could pull without disrupting existing production lines. Steele paused at the threshold, studying the group that would help him create America's answer to Soviet armor supremacy. 4 individuals seated around a table, their conversation halting as Porter and Steele entered. Gentleman and lady, Porter announced, Colonel Frank Steele, your new project director. The first to rise was a man in his 40s with the bearing of a career officer. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Morrison, Colonel, Army Ordnance Corps, specializing in ballistics and armor. Steele shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. Morrison had the polished look of Pentagon staff, his uniform immaculate, ribbons suggesting limited combat experience, but extensive technical expertise. Next came a weathered man with sergeant stripes and hands calloused from years of mechanical work. Master Sergeant Henry Wilson, sir, everyone calls me Doc. Recognition flashed in Steele's eyes. 3rd Armored Division, for Doc grinned, revealing a gold tooth. Surprised you remember, Colonel. I was just a grease monkey keeping your tanks running outside St. Lo. You saved my platoon when our transmission seized up during the push east, Steele recalled. Good to have you, Doc. The 3rd member stepped forward, a woman in her 30s wearing civilian clothes and a determined expression. Sarah Thompson, Colonel, MIT Engineering, specializing in metallurgy. I've been consulting with Army Ordnance for 3 years on armor composition. Steele concealed his surprise at finding a female engineer on the team. The war had opened doors previously closed to women, but many had been forced out of technical positions during demobilization. Thompson's presence indicated exceptional talent. Ms. Thompson's work on ceramic composite armor has been revolutionary, Porter added. The Pentagon insisted on her involvement. The final team member approached with the confident stride of youth. Young, perhaps 30, with lieutenant's bars and an air of academic intensity. Lieutenant James Harrison, sir, tank gunnery instructor from Fort Knox. I've specialized in fire control systems for the past 4 years. Steele measured the young officer. Harrison held himself with barely contained energy, eyes bright with intelligence, but also something else. Ambition, perhaps, or skepticism. Colonel Steele will have operational command of Project Thunderbolt, General Porter announced. I expect full cooperation from all personnel. The timeline is not negotiable. Questions can be directed to Colonel Steele. With that, Porter departed, leaving Steele alone with his new team. Silence hung in the air for a moment before Steele spoke. I understand you've all been briefed on our objective. We need a tank that can go toe-to-toe with the Soviet IS-3. We have 18 months. With respect, Colonel, Harrison interjected immediately, that timeline is impossible for a completely new design. Which is why we're not designing from scratch, Steele replied evenly. We'll use the M46 patent chassis and drivetrain. Our focus will be mounting a 120mm gun in a redesigned turret with improved armor protection. Doc Wilson whistled. A 120mm gun on a patent chassis? That's going to throw off the center of gravity something fierce. Sarah Thompson nodded agreement. We'll need to completely redesign the turret ring and counterweight systems. And the recoil forces will be tremendous. These are precisely the challenges we need to overcome, Steele said, moving to a large blueprint table. Show me what you've accomplished so far. Morrison stepped forward, unrolling technical drawings. We've begun preliminary work on adapting the T-53 120mm gun for tank mounting. The gun itself is proven technology from our fixed coastal defenses. The team gathered around the table as Morrison detailed existing progress. Steele listened carefully, noting the technical expertise but also the lack of field perspective. These were brilliant minds, but most lacked direct combat experience against superior enemy tanks. The gun is only part of the equation, Steele interjected. We need to consider crew workflow, ammunition storage, target acquisition under battlefield conditions. With due respect, Colonel, Harrison said, the technical specifications of the IS-3 are our primary concern. Their armor thickness, their gun performance. Specifications didn't save my gunner when a Panther put an 88mm round through our front plate, Steele countered, his voice level but intense. Understanding the enemy's capabilities is essential, but so is creating a weapon system that real crews can fight effectively with under combat conditions. The statement hung in the air, establishing Steele's perspective from the outset. This would not be merely a technical exercise, but a practical development of a combat system men would stake their lives on. Now, Steele continued, I want a complete review of our resources, current progress, and initial testing plans by tomorrow morning. 18 months isn't long, but it's enough if we work efficiently. As the team dispersed to their tasks, Steele remained at the blueprint table, studying the preliminary designs. The challenge was immense, but not insurmountable. American industrial and engineering capacity, when properly focused, could achieve remarkable results. He had witnessed it during the war when production lines had transitioned from civilian automobiles to tanks and aircraft in a matter of months. Later that evening, alone in his Spartan quarters on base, Steele composed a letter to his son William. The words came haltingly as he attempted to explain his new assignment without violating security protocols. Their recent conversations had been strained, the generational gap widening as William embraced post-war technologies and strategies that Steele viewed with cautious skepticism. Your studies at West Point must be preparing you for the rapidly changing nature of warfare, Steele wrote. While you focus on the future, I find myself called upon to address immediate challenges facing our forces in Korea. The lessons of the past remain relevant even as we develop new approaches. He paused, pen hovering over paper. How to bridge the divide between father and son, between the hard lessons of World War II and the theoretical warfare of the atomic age? William had never seen combat, never commanded men under fire. His understanding of warfare came from textbooks and instructors who increasingly viewed conventional armored warfare as secondary to nuclear strategy and air power. The telephone's shrill ring interrupted his thoughts. Steele answered to find General Porter on the line, his voice tense. Colonel, we've received new intelligence from Korea. A Soviet military advisor has been captured with documents referring to IS-3 deployments scheduled for spring. The timeline has accelerated. Steele's grip tightened on the receiver. How does this affect our project? Washington is pushing for initial prototypes within 10 months instead of 15. I'm sorry, Frank. I know it's nearly impossible, but the situation on the ground is deteriorating. After hanging up, Steele returned to his half-finished letter, adding a final paragraph. The work ahead will be demanding, but necessary. Perhaps someday you will understand that while technology and tactics evolve, the fundamental nature of war remains unchanged. Men still fight and die on the ground, taking and holding territory. And sometimes the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death, comes down to the quality of the machines we provide them. He signed the letter and sealed it in an envelope, wondering if his son would truly comprehend the stakes. Tomorrow would begin the race against time, a desperate effort to ensure American tankers wouldn't face the same disadvantages that had cost so many lives during the early years of the last war. The days quickly blurred into a relentless routine. Dawn to dusk in the development facility, nights spent reviewing technical reports and performance data. Steele drove his team hard but himself harder, sleeping only when exhaustion demanded it. The pressure created both progress and friction. 6 weeks into the project, the first major conflict erupted during a design review. Lieutenant Harrison presented modifications to reduce the turret profile, sacrificing gun depression angles for a smaller silhouette. The smaller we make the target, the better chance our tanks have of survival, Harrison argued, pointing to design sketches. Steele studied the proposal. And when our tanks need to fire from behind a ridgeline or engage targets in urban environments from street level. With respect, Colonel, those are niche tactical scenarios, Harrison countered. The primary engagements in Korea occur in open terrain. Doc Wilson shook his head. You ever actually fought in a tank, Lieutenant? Every damn scenario becomes niche when you're under fire. You need flexibility. The lieutenant has valid concerns about target profile, Morrison interjected, always the diplomat. Perhaps we can find a compromise. Tension filled the room as Steele considered the competing perspectives. Harrison represented the new school of thought, emphasizing technical specifications over combat adaptability. The designs looked impressive on paper, but ignored battlefield realities Steele had experienced firsthand. We proceed with the original turret height, Steele decided finally. Gun depression capability is non-negotiable. Our tanks must fight effectively in all terrain. Harrison's jaw tightened, but he offered no further argument. Later, Steele overheard him muttering to Morrison, "This is why we're falling behind the Russians. Old war horses making decisions based on the last war instead of the next one." The comment stung more than Steele cared to admit. Was he indeed a relic, clinging to outdated concepts? Or did his hard-won experience provide insights these younger, technically brilliant, but combat-inexperienced officers lacked? The question haunted him as weeks turned to months. Progress came in fits and starts. Sarah Thompson's metallurgical expertise proved invaluable in developing a new turret casting capable of handling the massive 120mm gun. Doc Wilson's practical mechanical knowledge helped solve drivetrain issues created by the increased weight. Morrison's ballistics calculations guided refinements to the fire control system. Even Harrison contributed significant improvements to the targeting systems. Though the lieutenant maintained a professional distance from Steele, their philosophical differences creating an undercurrent of tension. December brought both a milestone and a complication. The first prototype turret was completed and mounted on an M46 chassis for initial testing. The massive gun transformed the familiar Patton silhouette into something more imposing, more deadly. "She's not pretty," Doc Wilson remarked as they prepared for the first live fire test, "but she looks mean as hell." The firing range had been cleared of all non-essential personnel. Steele, his core team, and General Porter stood at a safe distance as the test crew took positions in the modified tank. Targets had been placed at various ranges, from 500 to 2,000 yards, including a captured Soviet T-34 for armor penetration tests. "Commence firing sequence," Steele ordered into the radio. The ground trembled as the 120mm gun roared to life. The massive shell streaked downrange, striking the first target dead center. Subsequent shots demonstrated exceptional accuracy at ranges far exceeding standard tank engagements. Then came the armor penetration test. The T-34 stood at 1,500 yards, its sloped armor once considered nearly impenetrable to American tank guns. The 120mm APDS round punched through the frontal armor as if it were paper, exiting through the rear of the turret in a spectacular display of destructive power. "Good God," Porter murmured. "That would cut through an IS-3 like butter." The test continued successfully until the 12th round. A catastrophic malfunction occurred as the breech failed to fully close before firing. The resulting explosion injured 2 crew members and severely damaged the prototype turret. In the aftermath, as medical personnel treated the wounded men, Harrison approached Steele. "The clearance tolerances were off by millimeters. The specifications I submitted called for tighter machining." The accusation hung in the air between them. Steele had indeed modified Harrison's specifications, considering them too precise for mass production under wartime conditions. "Lieutenant, a tank that can't be manufactured in quantity is just an expensive museum piece," Steele responded evenly. "We need weapons that can be produced rapidly by American factories." "And crews that get blown up because of manufacturing shortcuts?" Harrison challenged, his voice rising. "Is that an acceptable cost?" Steele felt his patience waning. "Nothing about this project involves shortcuts, Lieutenant. Every decision balances performance, production reality, and combat effectiveness. If you can't understand that fundamental truth, perhaps you're assigned to the wrong project." Harrison's face flushed, but before he could respond, the facility doors burst open. An orderly approached at a run, holding a telegram. "Urgent message for Colonel Steele, sir." Steele broke the seal, reading quickly. His expression remained neutral, but those who knew him well could detect the subtle shift in his bearing. "Gentlemen, we have a new team member arriving tomorrow. West Point class of 1951, engineering focus, assigned directly by the Pentagon." Doc Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Fresh out of the academy? What's so special about this kid?" "His name is Second Lieutenant William Steele," Frank answered, refolding the telegram. "My son." The announcement landed like a shell among the team. Morrison and Thompson exchanged glances. Harrison's expression shifted from surprise to calculation. Doc Wilson simply chuckled. "Well," the sergeant said finally, "this should make things interesting." Steele turned away, his mind racing. William's assignment couldn't be coincidence. Either his son had requested the posting, or someone at the Pentagon thought family ties might accelerate the project. Either way, the development complicated an already challenging command situation. That night, unable to sleep, Frank Steele stood alone on the testing range, the damaged prototype looming in the darkness like a wounded predator. The challenge before him had just increased exponentially. Not only was he racing against time to develop a weapon that could save American lives in Korea, but now he would do so while navigating the complex relationship with his only son, a young officer whose views on warfare and technology diverged sharply from his own. The winter wind carried the distant sound of artillery practice, a rhythm as familiar to Steele as his own heartbeat. Whatever complications tomorrow would bring, the fundamental mission remained unchanged. American tanks needed a weapon capable of defeating the Soviet behemoths. The lives of young men like those injured today depended on it. Frank Steele squared his shoulders and turned back toward the facility, resolve hardening within him like tempered steel. Personal challenges would not deter him from delivering what America's tankers desperately needed: the thunder to match the gathering storm. Chapter 4. Conflict and Convergence. The staff car arrived precisely at 0800 hours, its tires crunching on gravel as it pulled up to the Project Thunderbolt facility. Frank Steele watched from the office window as a tall, slender figure in officer's dress uniform emerged, duffel bag in hand. Even at a distance, the resemblance between father and son was unmistakable in the set of the shoulders, in the deliberate way William Steele surveyed his surroundings before proceeding to the entrance. 5 years had passed since they'd last stood face to face. Letters and occasional telephone calls had maintained a tenuous connection, but the growing philosophical divide between them had made meaningful communication increasingly difficult. William had Catherine's thoughtful eyes and Frank's stubborn jaw, physical traits that hinted at the internal conflict between intellectual curiosity and unyielding determination. The young lieutenant reported to the security checkpoint, his posture textbook perfect. Frank moved to the conference room where the team gathered for morning briefing, choosing to make this first encounter a professional one rather than personal. William entered the room precisely on time, saluting crisply. "Second Lieutenant William Steele reporting as ordered, sir." Frank returned the salute with equal formality. "Lieutenant, welcome to Project Thunderbolt. He gestured to the assembled team. You'll be working with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison on turret design integration. Report to him for your specific duties. If William was disappointed by the businesslike reception from his father, he concealed it well. Yes, sir, I've reviewed the project files provided by the Pentagon. I understand we're facing significant challenges with the recoil management system. Among other things, Frank confirmed, turning to address the entire team. Yesterday's test revealed multiple issues requiring immediate attention. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison will outline our revised testing schedule. Lieutenant Harrison has modifications to the breach mechanism to prevent recurrence of the malfunction. The meeting proceeded with technical discussions, performance metrics, and timeline assessments. William contributed sparingly but intelligently, suggesting modifications to the turret ring based on recent metallurgical advances he'd studied at West Point. His knowledge was theoretical but impressive, demonstrating why the Pentagon had considered him valuable to the project despite his youth and inexperience. As the team dispersed to their tasks, father and son found themselves momentarily alone. The professional veneer slipped slightly as William spoke in a lower, more personal tone. Mom writes that you're working 18-hour days. Says you barely mentioned the project in your letters home. Frank's expression remained neutral. Security protocols limit what I can share. And yes, our timeline demands extensive hours. William hesitated, then added, I requested this assignment, Dad, not to complicate things, but because I believe I can contribute. My thesis at West Point focused on next-generation armor design, specifically addressing Soviet heavy tank threats. The Pentagon forwarded your thesis, Frank acknowledged. Your theoretical models have merit, but this project requires practical solutions that can be implemented immediately. We don't have the luxury of exploring experimental approaches. William's jaw tightened in a manner eerily reminiscent of his father. The theoretical becomes practical when properly applied. The solutions I propose for composite armor layering could reduce weight while maintaining protection levels. Weight isn't our primary concern, Frank countered. Firepower and reliability under combat conditions take precedence. Your ideas may be valuable for future designs, but Thunderbolt must be deployable within months, not years. That mindset is exactly why we're constantly playing catch-up to Soviet advances, William replied, an edge entering his voice. They're already working on the next generation, while we're struggling to match their current capabilities. Frank felt the familiar frustration rising. The same argument they'd had through letters for years, now face to face. We build tanks for the wars we're fighting, not the theoretical conflicts of tomorrow. Ask any tanker in Korea if he'd prefer a flawless weapon 5 years from now or a good one next month. The conversation might have escalated further had Doc Wilson not entered, grease-stained and apologetic. Excuse the interruption, Colonel, but we've identified a critical issue with the main gun elevation mechanism. You'll want to see this. The professional mask slid back into place as Frank nodded. We'll continue this discussion later, Lieutenant. Report to Colonel Morrison and familiarize yourself with our current design iterations. William saluted, perfect form concealing the tension beneath. Yes, sir. The subsequent weeks established a pattern. During working hours, William functioned as any junior officer, deferential to rank and focused on assigned tasks. His technical knowledge proved valuable, particularly in redesigning the turret interior to accommodate the massive 120mm rounds while maintaining crew workspace. In team meetings, however, philosophical differences became apparent as William consistently advocated for more advanced technologies that Frank deemed impractical within their constraints. December snow blanketed Aberdeen as the team pushed toward a revised prototype. The facility rarely emptied, with engineers and mechanics working in shifts around the clock. Frank maintained his grueling schedule, reviewing every aspect of the design personally, often sleeping on a cot in his office rather than returning to his quarters. Late one evening, Frank entered the deserted drafting room to find William alone, surrounded by technical drawings and calculation sheets. The young lieutenant didn't notice his father's arrival, completely absorbed in his work. Frank paused, taking the opportunity to observe his son unguarded. The intense concentration, the methodical approach to problem-solving, the dedication to the task at hand, all reflected qualities Frank had tried to instill since William was a boy. You should get some rest, Frank said finally. Fresh eyes see solutions tired ones miss. William looked up, momentarily startled. Just finalizing the counterweight calculations for the new turret design. If we shift mass distribution by adjusting ammunition storage, We can improve gun depression angles without compromising balance. Frank approached, studying the drawings. The solution was elegant, addressing multiple issues simultaneously. This is good work. The simple praise, rarely offered, hung in the air between them. William's expression softened slightly. Thanks, Dad. Frank pulled up a chair sitting across from his son. Your mother's Christmas package arrived today. She sent enough cookies for the entire team. A small smile tugged at William's lips. Molasses ginger? She always makes those for Christmas. And peanut butter chocolate chip, your favorite. The mention of home traditions created a momentary bridge across the professional and philosophical divide. For a brief interval, they were simply father and son rather than colonel and lieutenant. How is she? William asked. Really? Her letters always say everything's fine. Frank considered his answer carefully. She misses both of us. Keeps busy with volunteer work at the Veterans Hospital. Says the house is too quiet. William nodded, guilt flickering across his features. I should have visited before taking this assignment. It's been too long. She understands duty, Frank assured him, better than most. The conversation lapsed into silence, neither man entirely comfortable with personal discussions. Frank studied the technical drawings again, using them as neutral territory. Have you considered the maintenance access implications of this configuration? Field repairs require sufficient clearance for replacement parts. William accepted the return to professional matters with visible relief. I've incorporated access panels here and here, he indicated on the drawing. They'll allow component replacement without removing the entire turret assembly. They spent the next hour refining the design together, finding unexpected common ground in the technical details. Frank contributed practical field experience, while William applied theoretical knowledge. The combination yielding improvements neither might have developed independently. As they concluded, William gathered his papers and hesitated. Dad, there's something I've been meaning to ask. The design specifications for the Soviet IS-3, some of the intelligence seems questionable, particularly the frontal armor thickness estimates. Frank's expression sharpened. Explain. According to captured documents, the maximum effective armor on the IS-3 is approximately 230mm equivalent when accounting for slope. But we're designing Thunderbolt to penetrate 280mm at standard engagement ranges. That's a significant overmatch that adds weight and complexity. Your point? William chose his words carefully. Are we certain the intelligence is accurate? Or are we building to counter an exaggerated threat? The question struck at Frank's core concerns. Intelligence on Soviet capabilities often contained contradictions and potential disinformation. He had pushed for the higher penetration capabilities precisely because he distrusted the lower estimates. We design for worst-case scenarios, not best-case hopes, Frank said finally. If we're wrong and the armor is thinner, we've wasted resources. If we're wrong and it's thicker, we've sent men into combat with inadequate weapons. William considered this, then nodded slowly. Like the Panthers at Normandy, intelligence underestimated their capabilities. Exactly. Frank was surprised and somewhat gratified that his son had studied this specific historical example. Hundreds of Sherman crews paid for that miscalculation with their lives. I understand the caution, William acknowledged, but there's an engineering cost to overdesign. Every millimeter of penetration capability we add creates cascading complications throughout the system. Then we solve those complications, Frank stated simply, because the alternative is unacceptable. The conversation might have continued, but the facility door opened as Sarah Thompson entered, her expression urgent. Colonel, we've received new technical data from Ordnance Division. The breech block casting has failed metallurgical testing. We'll need to completely redesign it. The moment of connection between father and son dissolved as duty reasserted its demands. Frank rose immediately. Show me the reports. As Frank followed Thompson to the testing lab, he glanced back to see William returning to his calculations, already absorbed once more in the technical challenges before him. Despite their differences, Frank felt a surprising surge of pride. Whatever else divided them, they shared a fundamental dedication to the mission, to protecting American tankers who would ultimately stake their lives on the machines they designed. The metallic sounds of construction greeted Christmas morning at Aberdeen. No holiday break could be afforded given their accelerated timeline. Frank arrived at the facility to find most of the team already present, including his son. Catherine had sent a small artificial tree and decorations, which Doc Wilson had enthusiastically installed in the break room. Someone had placed wrapped packages beneath it, an attempt at normalcy amid the pressure of their work. "Merry Christmas, Colonel," Morrison greeted him. "We've prepared a surprise. The revised prototype turret is ready for initial mechanical testing." Frank followed Morrison to the main bay where the massive new turret sat mounted on an M46 chassis. The redesigned structure incorporated Williams' counterweight adjustments and Sarah Thompson's improved metallurgical specifications. Its silhouette was distinctly American, yet unlike any tank the U.S. had previously fielded. The 180 mm gun jutted forward aggressively, promising destructive power far beyond existing armor. "We've incorporated all the modifications from the first test failure," Morrison explained. "Improved breech mechanism, enhanced recoil management, redesigned ammunition storage." Williams stood beside the vehicle, explaining technical details to General Porter, who had arrived to witness the milestone. The young lieutenant's face lit with enthusiasm as he described the innovations incorporated into the design. For all their disagreements, Frank couldn't deny his son's genuine passion for the work. "When can we schedule live fire testing?" Frank asked Morrison. "January 10th, assuming component verification proceeds as expected. We'll need at least 2 weeks to ensure all systems function properly." Frank nodded approval. "Coordinate with range control. I want a comprehensive testing protocol, including rapid fire cycles and maximum range engagements." As the team gathered for a modest Christmas lunch in the break room, Frank noticed a developing camaraderie that transcended rank and specialization. Doc Wilson regaled them with improbable stories from his service in North Africa. Sarah Thompson shared discoveries from her metallurgical research. Even the usually reserved Lieutenant Harrison contributed anecdotes from tank gunnery school. William, initially hesitant, gradually joined the conversations, offering insights from West Point and connecting with the team as a colleague rather than merely the colonel's son. Frank observed more than participated, taking quiet satisfaction in the unit cohesion developing before him. Complex projects forged bonds that often lasted lifetimes. These disparate individuals, united by common purpose, reminded him of combat units he had commanded, where shared danger and hardship created connections that transcended background differences. The impromptu celebration concluded as an orderly delivered an urgent message for Frank. He read it quickly, his expression revealing nothing as he excused himself. William, attuned to his father's subtle cues, followed him into the hallway. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. Frank hesitated, then handed him the message. "Intelligence update from Korea. Chinese forces have entered the conflict in significant numbers. They've reportedly deployed a new tank destroyer with a 100mm gun. 3 M46 Pattons destroyed in the initial engagement." William absorbed the information, its implications immediately clear. They're escalating the arms race. If they're fielding 100 guns now, the IS-3 deployment can't be far behind, Frank finished the thought. "Our timeline just got tighter, son." For once, William didn't argue or theorize. He simply nodded, determination replacing academic detachment. "I'll review the powertrain stress tests. If we can safely increase performance margins, we might accelerate the development schedule." Frank placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a rare physical gesture between them. "We'll meet after dinner to revise project milestones." As William returned to the celebration, Frank remained in the hallway, the weight of the message settling on him. Somewhere in the frozen mountains of Korea, American tankers were fighting and dying in vehicles increasingly outmatched by their opponents. The comfortable Christmas gathering in Maryland stood in stark contrast to their desperate reality. Frank Steele straightened his shoulders and returned to the break room, his mind already calculating accelerated testing schedules and production timelines. Time was the one resource they couldn't manufacture or redesign, and with each passing day, the thunder of enemy guns grew closer to American lines. The new year arrived without ceremony at Aberdeen. January brought biting cold and renewed urgency as reports from Korea detailed desperate tank battles in snow-covered mountains. The revised Thunderbolt prototype had passed mechanical testing, demonstrating proper turret rotation, gun elevation, and loading mechanisms. Now came the critical phase, live fire testing to validate the complete weapon system under realistic conditions. Frank stood on the observation platform overlooking the firing range. Targets had been positioned at distances from 500 to 3,000 yards, including armored vehicles acquired from various sources, a captured T-34, a decommissioned Panther obtained from Germany, and steel plates of varying thicknesses to simulate IS-3 armor. William approached, clipboard in hand. "Final pre-test checklist complete, sir. Ammunition loaded, crew briefed on testing protocol." Frank nodded acknowledgement. You should observe from the command vehicle. Best vantage point for technical assessment. William hesitated. Actually, sir, I'd like to request permission to join the test crew, specifically as loader. Frank turned to his son, surprised. That position wasn't designated for officer observation. It's not about observation, William explained. The loading mechanism incorporates my design modifications. I should experience its actual operation firsthand. The request gave Frank pause. The loader position in a tank was physically demanding, requiring strength and coordination to handle the massive 120mm shells. But William's reasoning was sound from an engineering perspective. Direct experience would provide insights no external observation could match. Permission granted, Frank decided. Report to the vehicle commander for position briefing. William saluted and hurried to the tank where the test crew prepared for the exercise. Frank watched his son climb onto the massive vehicle, disappearing into the turret with practiced movements that suggested more familiarity with tank operations than Frank had realized. Perhaps William's theoretical knowledge had been supplemented by practical experience at West Point that he'd never mentioned in their correspondence. The radio crackled. Thunderbolt test vehicle ready for firing sequence, awaiting authorization. Frank lifted the handset. This is Colonel Steele. You are authorized to commence testing. Proceed with standard protocol. The massive tank roared to life, its engine growling as it maneuvered into firing position. The 120mm gun elevated slightly, aligning with the first target. Frank raised binoculars, focusing on the distant steel plate representing an enemy tank at 1,000 yards. The blast, when it came, exceeded expectations. Thunderbolt's massive gun erupted with a concussion that spectators felt in their chests despite the distance. The shell streaked downrange, striking the target dead center. Through his binoculars, Frank observed complete penetration of the steel plate, the round continuing through to impact the earthen berm beyond. Cheers erupted among the observation team. The second shot followed quickly, demonstrating the loader's efficiency. Another direct hit, another clean penetration. The vehicle proceeded methodically through the testing sequence, engaging targets at increasing ranges. At 2,000 yards, the accuracy remained impressive, each round finding its mark with devastating effect. Then came the armor penetration tests. The 120mm gun roared again, sending a specially designed APDS round toward the captured T-34. The shell punched through the frontal armor as if it were cardboard, exiting the rear in a spectacular display of destructive power. Similar results followed with the Panther tank, once considered nearly impervious to American tank guns. Frank allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. If the performance data matched visual observation, Thunderbolt could indeed counter the IS-3 threat effectively. The weapon they had labored to create was proving its worth. The testing continued smoothly until the rapid-fire sequence. The protocol called for 5 rounds fired in quick succession to evaluate heat dissipation and mechanical stress under combat conditions. The first 3 rounds performed flawlessly. During the 4th loading cycle, something went catastrophically wrong. A muffled explosion erupted from the turret, followed by smoke pouring from the open hatch. Alarms sounded across the testing facility as emergency crews rushed forward. Frank dropped the binoculars, already running toward the vehicle, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tank commander emerged from the turret, face blackened by smoke. The gunner followed, coughing violently. Frank reached the tank as medical personnel arrived with stretchers. His voice remained controlled despite the fear clawing at his throat. Status report. What happened? The commander wiped soot from his eyes. Breach failure, sir. Round detonated partially during loading. Fire in the turret. Frank's gaze locked on the turret hatch. Casualties? Loader's injured, sir. Lieutenant Steele, he's still inside. The professional mask Frank had maintained throughout the project cracked in that moment. Without hesitation, he climbed onto the tank, ignoring protests from safety personnel. Smoke billowed from the open hatch as he lowered himself into the turret. The interior was a scene from hell. Electrical fires sparked in the confined space. Ammunition storage compartments had been compromised. And there, slumped against the breech mechanism, was William. Blood streaked his face from a head wound, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. William! Frank moved through the smoke, reaching his son. Can you hear me? William's eyes flickered open, recognition dawning through the pain. Dad? The breech. Manufacturing defect? Saw it starting to crack. Frank checked his son's wounds quickly, assessing that while serious, They weren't immediately life-threatening. "We need to get you out. Can you move?" William grimaced. "Think my arm's broken and my leg?" Outside, voices called urgently. "Colonel Steele, the ammunition compartment is compromised. You need to evacuate immediately." Frank made his decision instantly. With strength born of desperate necessity, he lifted his son, maneuvering him toward the hatch. William bit back cries of pain as they navigated the damaged interior. Reaching the turret opening, Frank pushed William up and into the waiting arms of rescue personnel before climbing out himself. They had barely cleared the vehicle when secondary explosions rocked the turret, sending shrapnel flying. Medical teams rushed William to a waiting ambulance. Frank followed, maintaining outward calm while internally shaken to his core. The ride to the base hospital passed in tense silence, broken only by the medics' routine checks and William's occasional gasps as the ambulance hit rough patches of road. Hours later, Frank sat beside his son's hospital bed. William's arm had been set and casted, his leg bandaged, and multiple lacerations sutured. The doctors reported no life-threatening injuries, but ordered observation for potential concussion and smoke inhalation. William stirred, eyes opening to find his father maintaining a silent vigil. "The test?" he asked, voice raspy. "We have the data from the successful firing," Frank replied. "The failure occurred during the rapid-fire sequence. Preliminary assessment suggests a manufacturing defect in the breech block, exactly as you identified before losing consciousness." William attempted to sit up, wincing with the effort. "I saw the fracture beginning after the third round. Tried to abort the loading sequence, but it was too late." Frank placed a restraining hand on his son's shoulder. "Your quick action prevented a complete detonation inside the turret. You saved the crew from more serious injuries." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotion. Finally, William spoke again, his voice quieter, more personal than professional. "I understand now, Dad, what you've been trying to tell me all these years, about the reality behind the specifications and theories." Frank waited, allowing his son to continue. "When I saw that breech starting to fail, it wasn't about metallurgical stress factors or expansion coefficients. It was about the men who would die if we got it wrong." William's eyes, so like his mother's, held new understanding. The difference between designing a weapon and commanding men who use it to fight. Frank nodded slowly. "That's why I pushed for the higher penetration capabilities despite the engineering challenges. That's why I insisted on practical solutions over theoretical ideals. Because when you have watched good men die in burning tanks, you err on the side of overwhelming force, not elegant efficiency." "I should have listened sooner," William admitted, "instead of arguing theoretical points." "And I should have better explained my reasoning," Frank countered, "instead of expecting you to accept my judgment without context." Another silence, more comfortable than the last. The professional divide that had separated them began to close, bridged by shared experience and mutual respect. "The project continues tomorrow," Frank said finally. "We'll incorporate the lessons from today's test failure, redesign the breach mechanism, improve the safety protocols." William nodded, determination visible through the fatigue and pain. "I'd like to review the telemetry data as soon as possible. The failure sequence might reveal other potential stress points we've overlooked." Frank allowed himself a small smile. His son remained an engineer at heart, approaching even his own injury as a technical problem to be analyzed and solved. But now that analytical mind was tempered by first-hand experience with the human cost of technical failures. "Rest first," Frank instructed. "The project needs you at full capacity." As William drifted back to sleep, Frank remained at his bedside, watching his son's chest rise and fall with each breath. Today's near tragedy had crystallized something Frank had struggled to articulate throughout the project. The tank they were creating wasn't merely a response to Soviet technology or a technical achievement to be measured in penetration statistics and armor thicknesses. It was, in the most fundamental sense, a promise to young Americans who would stake their lives on its performance. A promise that Frank Steele and his son now shared a deeper understanding of, forged in smoke and fire, as theory met reality in the confined space of a tank turret. Whatever technical challenges remained in Project Thunderbolt, father and son would face them with newfound common purpose. The distance between them closing like a well-engineered breach block, secure against the pressures of combat to come. The new year arrived at Aberdeen with a vengeance, howling winds driving snow against the windows of the Thunderbolt facility. Inside, the team labored in the artificial summer of overheated workshops. the contrast between worlds marked by the fog that formed on the glass when doors opened to admit supplies or personnel. Frank Steele studied the revised prototype from the observation platform. The modifications suggested by his son had been incorporated into the turret design, creating a more balanced profile without sacrificing gun depression angles. Engineers swarmed around the vehicle making final adjustments before the critical live fire test scheduled for the following day. "She's looking good," Doc Wilson remarked, joining Steele at the railing. The veteran sergeant's hands were stained with grease, evidence of his hands-on approach to problem solving. "Your boy's counterweight distribution calculations were spot on. Rotation mechanisms are smooth as silk now." Steele nodded, allowing a hint of pride to surface. William has always had an eye for balance. Even as a child, he could build towers of blocks taller than seemed possible. Doc chuckled. "Apple doesn't fall far, does it? Though I'd say he's got more of his mother's patience. You were always more the ram it through and make it work type." The observation contained more truth than Steele cared to admit. His approach to problems had always been direct, sometimes forceful. Catherine's temperament was more measured, analytical. William seemed to have inherited both traits, applying them to engineering challenges with impressive results. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah Thompson's arrival. The metallurgist carried a folder of test results, her expression troubled. "Colonel, we have a situation with the breech block. The new alloy isn't performing as expected under extreme temperature variation testing." Steele's expression darkened. "Explain." "At temperatures below freezing, the metal becomes brittle. Microfractures form along stress points." She opened the folder showing test photographs. "In combat conditions in Korea, this could lead to catastrophic failure." The implications were clear and dire. Tomorrow's test would have to be postponed. The breech redesign would set them back weeks, perhaps months. With each delay, American tankers in Korea remained vulnerable to Soviet heavy armor. "Options?" Steele asked, his voice tightly controlled. "Lieutenant Harrison suggests reverting to the original alloy with enhanced heat treatment. More conventional, but proven reliable in cold weather operations." "And your assessment?" Sarah hesitated. "It would work, but at a cost to performance. Reduced muzzle velocity, slower rate of fire." "Where is William? I want his input on this." "In the metallurgy lab with Harrison. They're discussing alternative approaches." The careful phrasing told Steele all he needed to know. His son and the lieutenant were likely engaged in another of their increasingly frequent technical disagreements. The two officers represented opposing philosophies. Harrison, the pragmatic traditionalist, William, the forward-thinking innovator. Both brilliant, both committed, both convinced of their approach. Steele found them in the laboratory, surrounded by material samples and testing equipment. Their conversation halted abruptly as he entered, the tension in the air palpable. "Gentlemen," Steele acknowledged both with a nod, "I understand we have a materials challenge with the breech block." Harrison stepped forward. "Yes, sir, I've recommended returning to the standard chromium steel alloy with enhanced tempering. We know it works, and we can have new components fabricated within 2 weeks." William's jaw tightened. "At the cost of performance, Dad. The standard alloy can't handle the chamber pressures we need for the penetration capabilities you insist upon." "We have another option," William continued. "A titanium alloy composite with molybdenum reinforcement. The theoretical performance exceeds our requirements, and preliminary tests suggest excellent cold weather performance." "Theoretical being the operative word," Harrison interjected. "It's never been used in a tank gun before. The manufacturing process is experimental at best, and production would take months." 3 weeks, William countered. "I've already discussed it with the metallurgical team at MIT. They can expedite development if we provide the test data." Frank studied both men, weighing more than just the technical merits of their proposals. This disagreement represented the fundamental tension that had defined the project from its inception: proven reliability versus innovative performance. "Show me the data," he said finally, both proposals side by side. For the next hour, Steele reviewed test results, production timelines, and performance projections. Harrison's approach was safe, conventional, but would indeed sacrifice the penetration capabilities needed to defeat IS-3 armor at combat ranges. Williams' proposal offered superior performance, but carried significant development risks. The decision would define the project's direction and potentially impact American tankers in Korea. Soldiers like the men who had served under him in Europe, like the crews who had burned in Shermans facing Panthers and Tigers. The weight of responsibility settled on him like armor plate. Lieutenant Harrison, Steele addressed the officer formally. Your concern for reliability is noted and appropriate. In combat, a weapon that fails endangers its crew and the mission. Harrison nodded, a hint of satisfaction crossing his features. However, Steele continued, this project exists precisely because we need exceptional performance. Standard approaches won't counter the Soviet advantage. He turned to his son. William, can you guarantee the titanium alloy composite will be ready for integration within 1 month? Not theoretically, not hopefully. Guarantee. William straightened. Yes, sir. I'll personally oversee the development with MIT and our metallurgy team here. Then that's our course, Steele decided. We'll proceed with the titanium composite. Tomorrow's test is postponed. I want daily progress reports on the alloy development. Harrison's expression tightened, but he offered a crisp, yes, sir, before departing. William remained, his expression reflecting both surprise and gratitude. Thank you for the opportunity, Dad. I won't let you down. Frank's response was measured. This isn't about you or me, Lieutenant. It's about giving our tankers the weapon they need. The moment your solution appears unviable, we revert to Harrison's approach. Understood? Completely, sir. As William departed to begin work on the alloy development, Frank remained in the laboratory staring at the material samples that represented such different approaches to the same problem. His decision had been professional, based on combat requirements, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction of supporting his son's innovative thinking. The line between command judgment and paternal pride had never seemed thinner. The following weeks transformed the project facility into an improvised metallurgical research center. Equipment from MIT arrived daily, as did specialists eager to participate in the cutting-edge development. William worked tirelessly, often sleeping on a cot in the laboratory rather than returning to his quarters. His dedication impressed even the skeptical Harrison, who gradually moved from opposition to cautious collaboration. Frank observed the process with measured optimism, careful not to show favoritism toward his son's approach. The initial results proved promising. The titanium composite demonstrated exceptional strength at varying temperatures. Production methods were refined, moving from theoretical to practical. The timeline William had promised appeared achievable, though barely. Late one evening, Frank entered the laboratory to find William alone, examining a newly cast breech block prototype under intense light. Any structural abnormalities? Frank asked, causing his son to look up with tired eyes. Nothing significant. The casting process is working. We'll begin stress testing tomorrow. Frank nodded, then gestured to the coffee pot. Mind if I join you? William seemed surprised by the informal request. Of course not. They sat across from each other at a small table in the corner of the lab, steam rising from their mugs. For a moment, neither spoke, the comfortable silence of shared purpose filling the space between them. You've impressed the team, Frank said finally. Even Harrison admits your approach is showing merit. A small smile crossed William's face. High praise, considering his initial skepticism. He's a good officer, cautious but for the right reasons. Like you, William observed, though you took a risk supporting my proposal. Frank considered this. Calculated risk, your reasoning was sound, your conviction genuine. Those qualities matter in command decisions. Is that what made you a successful tank commander? Calculated risks? The question carried more than professional curiosity. William had rarely asked about his father's combat experiences, perhaps sensing the pain those memories carried. Frank took a sip of coffee, organizing his thoughts. Sometimes, he answered slowly, in combat, decisions often come down to incomplete information and limited time. You assess what you know, consider what you don't, then commit fully to your chosen action. Like Bastogne, William said quietly, when you lost half your platoon but saved the infantry company. Frank's cup paused halfway to his lips. He had never shared the details of that battle with his son. Where did you hear about that? Doc Wilson mentioned it, said it was the most extraordinary tank action he'd witnessed during the war. Frank set his cup down carefully. Doc exaggerates. We were simply in the right place at the right time to spring an ambush. That's not how he tells it. He said you deliberately drew fire from the German heavies to reveal their positions, knowing your Sherman couldn't withstand direct hits. The memory surfaced unbidden, snow falling through pine trees, the weight of command, the knowledge that his decisions would determine which of his men lived and which died. It was necessary, Frank said simply. Sometimes victory requires sacrifice. William studied his father's face, perhaps seeing for the first time the burden that Frank had carried home from Europe. Not just memories of combat, but the weight of lives lost under his command. Decisions made that couldn't be unmade. Is that why you pushed so hard on this project? William asked. Because of the men you lost to German heavy tanks? Frank hadn't expected such perception from his son. The question struck at the core motivation he rarely acknowledged even to himself. Partly, he admitted, when you've ordered men into combat with inadequate weapons, when you've pulled burned bodies from destroyed tanks, you develop a certain perspective on equipment development. I understand better now, William said. Why you insist on the penetration capabilities, the reliability under combat conditions. It's not abstract for you. It shouldn't be abstract for any of us, Frank replied. Every technical decision we make will eventually translate to life or death for some young American in a steel box facing enemy fire. The conversation might have continued, but an urgent knocking interrupted them. Sarah Thompson entered, her expression animated with excitement. Lieutenant Steele, the initial stress test on the composite samples just came back. The results are beyond our projections. This alloy could revolutionize tank gun design. William rose immediately. Show me the data. As they moved to the testing area, Frank remained at the table, finishing his coffee in solitude. The project continued its relentless pace, but something had shifted between father and son. A barrier had fallen, revealing common ground beneath their differences. Technical challenges remained, but the personal obstacles seemed less insurmountable than before. The titanium composite breech block exceeded all performance expectations in testing. By early February, the redesigned component was ready for integration into the prototype. The live fire test was rescheduled, with even greater anticipation than before. Intelligence reports from Korea added urgency, as rumors circulated of Soviet advisors accompanying Chinese forces near the front lines. The morning of the test dawned clear and cold, the firing range crystalline under winter sunlight. Frank stood with General Porter and visiting Pentagon officials as the test crew prepared the prototype vehicle. William had volunteered to serve as technical observer inside the tank during the firing sequence, a position Frank had approved despite his private concerns about safety. Impressive progress, Frank, Porter commented. When you proposed the titanium composite approach, I had my doubts. Seems your gamble paid off. Lieutenant William Steele deserves the credit, Frank replied, deliberately using his son's formal title. He championed the approach and oversaw its development. Porter nodded knowingly. Must be gratifying to see your son proving himself under your command. Before Frank could respond, the radio crackled with the tank commander's voice. Thunderbolt test vehicle in position and ready. All systems nominal. Awaiting authorization to commence firing sequence. Frank lifted the handset. This is Colonel Steele. You are authorized to begin testing. Proceed with standard protocol. The first shot from the 120mm gun sent a shockwave across the observation area. Through binoculars, Frank tracked the shell to its target, a steel plate representing IS-3 frontal armor at 1,500 yards. The round struck dead center, punching through with devastating effect. A second shot followed quickly, then a third, each finding its mark with precision that exceeded previous testing. My God, whispered a Pentagon observer. That penetration is remarkable. The Soviets have nothing that could withstand this. The rapid fire sequence began. 5 rounds in quick succession, testing the new breech block under maximum stress conditions. Frank held his breath as each round fired successfully, the titanium composite performing flawlessly under combat simulation. After the final shot, a cheer erupted from the observation team. The test had been an unqualified success. As the prototype returned to the staging area, Frank moved to meet it, unable to suppress his pride in both the achievement and his son's contribution. The tank commander emerged first, followed by the gunner and driver. William appeared last, his face smudged with carbon but split by a wide grin. He jumped down from the turret, greeting his father with uncharacteristic informality. It worked perfectly, Dad. Chamber pressure stable throughout the sequence. No signs of metal fatigue or stress fractures. The composite actually improved accuracy by reducing barrel harmonics. Frank allowed himself a rare smile. Excellent work, Lieutenant. The entire team should be commended. As technicians swarmed the vehicle to collect data, William pulled his father aside. There's more. I've been working with Sarah on applying the composite technology to the projectiles themselves. Preliminary calculations suggest we could increase penetration by another 20%. The enthusiasm in his son's voice reminded Frank of the boy who had disassembled and reassembled his bicycle at age 10, proudly demonstrating improvements to the braking system. That same innovative spirit now focused on creating weapons that could save American lives in combat. Draft a formal proposal, Frank instructed. We'll present it to General Porter tomorrow. The celebration continued back at the main facility, where Doc Wilson had somehow procured champagne despite military regulations. As the team toasted their success, Frank observed the camaraderie that had developed among these disparate individuals united by common purpose. Morrison's tactical expertise complemented Sarah Thompson's scientific brilliance. Harrison's cautious thoroughness balanced Williams' innovative drive. Even the tension between the two lieutenants had evolved into productive competition. The moment of triumph was interrupted by the arrival of a Pentagon courier bearing sealed orders. The team fell silent as Frank opened the envelope and read its contents, his expression revealing nothing. "Gentlemen, lady," he addressed the group formally, "I've just received updated intelligence and new directives from Washington. Chinese forces have launched a major offensive along the Central Front in Korea. They're reportedly equipped with new armor, including what reconnaissance believes are the first IS-3 tanks deployed to the theater." The mood in the room shifted instantly from celebration to grave focus. "Our timeline has been accelerated," Frank continued. "Washington wants operational prototypes ready for deployment within 60 days. Production preparations must begin immediately." Morrison stepped backward. "Sir, that's barely enough time to complete safety certification, let alone prepare manufacturing specifications." "Nevertheless, those are our orders," Frank replied. "As of now, all leave is canceled. We'll operate in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison will coordinate with Aberdeen manufacturing facilities to begin production preparations. Lieutenant Harrison will oversee safety certification protocols. Lieutenant Steele and Ms. Thompson will finalize ammunition specifications." As the team dispersed to their new assignments, Frank remained alone with the orders, studying the attached reconnaissance photographs showing what appeared to be heavy tanks accompanying Chinese infantry near the 38th parallel. If these were indeed IS-3s, American forces would face a deadly threat for which they were unprepared, unless Thunderbolt could be deployed in time. Chapter 6. Crucible of Fire. The pressure to accelerate Thunderbolt's development created both progress and problems. Manufacturing specifications were rushed to production facilities before final testing was complete. Safety protocols were compressed, with simulations replacing physical testing where possible. The prototype underwent continuous modification, each improvement immediately documented for production implementation. Frank Steele rarely left the facility, catching brief periods of sleep on the cot in his office before returning to oversight duties. The responsibility weighed heavily, knowing that shortcuts now could mean lives lost later. Yet the reports from Korea allowed no respite. American tank units faced increasingly effective enemy armor, with casualties mounting weekly. Williams similarly threw himself into the work, focusing on ammunition development with Sarah Thompson. Their collaboration had yielded remarkable results, including a new armor-piercing fin, stabilized discarding sabot round with unprecedented penetration capabilities. When tested against captured Soviet armor plate, the projectile had cut through like a drill through butter. Inevitable tensions arose from the accelerated timeline. Harrison clashed with Morrison over safety certification procedures. Production engineers complained about constantly changing specifications. Doc Wilson battled procurement officers for priority access to critical components. These conflicts landed on Frank's desk daily, requiring his arbitration and decision. The command burden grew as political pressure from Washington intensified. Weekly briefings with Pentagon officials became exercises in diplomatic evasion as Frank protected his team from unreasonable demands while assuring superiors of continued progress. 6 weeks into the accelerated timeline, the project faced its most serious challenge yet. Frank called an emergency meeting of the core team, his expression grave as they gathered in the conference room. "The first production prototype failed catastrophically during remote testing yesterday," he announced without preamble. "Turret ring structural failure during rapid-fire sequence. If it had been crude, we would have lost everyone inside." Stunned silence greeted this news. They had all reviewed the production specifications, certified the designs as sound. "How?" William asked finally. "The materials should have been more than adequate for the stress loads." Frank activated a projector showing photographs of the damaged vehicle. Production quality control. The manufacturer deviated from our alloy specifications to meet the accelerated timeline. Used standard steel instead of the high tensile alloy we required for the mounting brackets. That's criminal negligence, Harrison said, anger evident in his voice. We were explicit about material requirements. It's a consequence of the timeline we're working under, Frank corrected. When production facilities are pushed to deliver in half the normal development cycle, corners get cut. What's our response? Morrison asked. I've ordered a complete halt to production pending quality control verification, Frank replied. Every component will be tested against specifications before assembly resumes. That will add weeks to the timeline, William pointed out. Washington won't be pleased. Better delayed than deployed with fatal flaws, Frank said firmly. I won't send American tankers into combat with equipment that could kill them before the enemy gets the chance. The decision, while necessary, created immediate political repercussions. That afternoon, Frank found himself on a secure telephone line with General Abrams from the Pentagon, defending his production halt order. Frank, I understand your concerns, Abrams' voice crackled through the receiver, but the situation in Korea is deteriorating. The 2nd Infantry Division lost 5 tanks just last week to enemy armor. They need Thunderbolt now. Bob, I can't in good conscience release a weapon that could kill its own crew, Frank replied. The production quality issues must be addressed. The Secretary is breathing down my neck. The President has been briefed on Thunderbolt as our answer to Soviet heavy armor. There's talk of sending an oversight committee to take control of the project. Frank's grip tightened on the receiver. That would be a mistake. My team knows this system intimately. Outside interference will only create further delays. Then give me something to hold them off, Abrams urged. A compromise position. Frank considered his options. I can authorize limited production of the turret and gun assembly for training purposes. Crews can familiarize themselves with the loading and firing procedures while we resolve the structural issues. That might work, Abrams said thoughtfully. I'll present it as a phased deployment approach. But Frank, I need a firm date for full production resumption. 3 weeks, Frank committed. We'll have the quality control issues resolved and production restarted. You have my word. After hanging up, Frank stared through his office window at the testing range beyond. The compromise bought time but increased pressure. 3 weeks to solve problems that would normally require months of engineering and testing. The strain on his team would be immense. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. William entered, carrying a folder of technical specifications. Dad, I've been reviewing the production protocols. I think I've identified where the quality control breakdown occurred. Frank gestured for his son to continue. The specifications for the turret ring components were transmitted to 3 different manufacturing facilities. No single plant had visibility of the complete assembly process. When material testing laboratories substituted the standard steel, they didn't realize the implications for the overall structural integrity. Your solution? Frank asked, noting the intensity in his son's expression. We need on-site engineering supervision at each facility, someone who understands the entire system, not just individual components. I've drafted a plan to deploy our team across the manufacturing network. Frank reviewed the proposal, impressed by its thoroughness. This would mean you and the other leads spending significant time away from Aberdeen. Yes, but it's the only way to ensure quality control meets our standards while maintaining the accelerated timeline. The plan made technical sense, but Frank hesitated. Dispersing his core team would complicate overall project coordination. Yet the alternative might be further production failures. Implement it, he decided, but I want daily reports and weekly in-person coordination meetings back here. Thank you, Dad, William said, then caught himself. I mean, Colonel. Frank allowed a small smile. In this office, the distinction matters. Out there, he gestured toward the production facilities, results matter more than protocol. Remember that when you're dealing with civilian manufacturers who may not appreciate military formalities. William nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. There's something else. A letter came from Mom today. He withdrew an envelope from his pocket. She's asking when we might be able to visit. Says it's been 5 months since she's seen either of us. The mention of Catherine struck Frank with unexpected force. In the all-consuming focus on Thunderbolt, he had maintained only minimal communication with his wife. Weekly letters, brief telephone calls when possible. She had never complained, understanding as always the demands of his service. Perhaps when production resumes, Frank said, knowing even as he spoke that the commitment was hollow. The project would demand his full attention until completion, perhaps beyond if field deployment issues arose. I could request a 48-hour leave for you, Williams suggested. The team can manage for 2 days. You haven't taken a single day off since the project began. The offer surprised Frank. His son was suggesting prioritizing family over the mission, something Frank had rarely done throughout his military career. The cost had been a distant relationship with William during his formative years, a regret that had grown as his son reached adulthood. "Let's get production restarted first," Frank replied. "Then we'll consider it." William accepted this with a nod, though Frank detected disappointment in his expression. Another deferred personal connection, another sacrifice to duty. The pattern was so familiar Frank barely recognized it anymore. As his son departed to implement the new production oversight plan, Frank turned back to the window, watching twilight settle over Aberdeen's testing ranges. Beyond lay America's eastern seaboard, and further still, the Korean peninsula where young men in tanks faced death daily. Their needs took precedence over personal considerations. Always had, always would. Yet Catherine's unspoken loneliness, conveyed through her simple request to visit, lingered in his thoughts as darkness fell. The production oversight plan proved effective. With project engineers directly supervising manufacturing processes, quality control improved dramatically. William spent most of his time at the material testing laboratory in Pennsylvania, ensuring the critical alloy components met specifications. Harrison oversaw assembly at the Detroit Tank Arsenal. Morrison coordinated with Aberdeen's on-site production facility. Daily reports flowed to Frank's desk, documenting progress and challenges. The dispersed team maintained remarkable cohesion despite physical separation, a testament to the bonds formed during the intense development phase. Weekly coordination meetings at Aberdeen consolidated efforts and resolved emerging issues. 3 weeks stretched to 4 as unforeseen complications arose. A nationwide steel shortage delayed component production. Transportation strikes in the Midwest temporarily halted shipping of completed assemblies. Each setback required adaptation and improvisation. Washington's patience thinned. General Abrams called almost daily, pressure evident in his voice as he relayed concerns from increasingly anxious superiors. The situation in Korea continued to deteriorate, with confirmed sightings of IS-3 tanks near the front lines. Finally, in late March, the first production quality prototype was completed and ready for comprehensive testing. The team reassembled at Aberdeen, tired but determined to validate their work. Frank studied the new vehicle with critical attention to detail. Externally, it resembled the earlier prototype, but internally, thousands of refinements had been incorporated based on testing and production realities. The 120mm gun gleamed in the spring sunlight, its titanium composite breech mechanism the most advanced tank gun ever fielded by American forces. "She's ready, Colonel," Doc Wilson announced after completing his pre-test inspection. "Everything checks out perfectly." The testing protocol would be the most rigorous yet. Continuous firing of 50 rounds to evaluate sustained performance. Mobility trials over rough terrain to test turret stabilization. Cold chamber testing to simulate Korean winter conditions. Every aspect of combat functionality would be evaluated before production authorization. William had returned from Pennsylvania the previous day, his face showing the strain of weeks overseeing manufacturing processes. Yet his eyes lit with pride as he walked the circumference of the production prototype. "We've become at a price from those first design sessions," he remarked to his father as they observed the final preparations. "Indeed," Frank agreed, "though the real test comes in combat. Engineering excellence means nothing if it doesn't perform when shells are flying." "It will perform," William stated with quiet confidence. "I'd stake my life on it." "Others will," Frank reminded him. "That's why this testing phase cannot be compromised, regardless of pressure from Washington." The first day of testing focused on the firing cycle. Round after round was loaded and fired, the massive gun performing flawlessly despite the punishing regimen. The new titanium composite breech showed no signs of stress or fatigue. Accuracy remained exceptional even as barrel temperature increased. On the second day, mobility trials demonstrated the vehicle's capability to fire accurately while moving over broken terrain. The stabilization system, incorporating innovations from Harrison's gunnery expertise, maintained target acquisition under conditions that would have rendered earlier tanks ineffective. Cold chamber testing on the third day confirmed the new alloy components functioned perfectly at temperatures well below those expected in Korean winters. Even the rubber seals and hydraulic systems, often the first to fail in extreme cold, performed to specification. By the fourth day, Frank allowed himself cautious optimism. The production prototype had exceeded performance requirements across every testing parameter. Barring unexpected failures in the final endurance trials, Thunderbolt would soon be ready for field deployment. That evening, the team gathered in the conference room to review testing data and prepare the production authorization report for Washington. The mood was positive but professional, years of military discipline preventing premature celebration. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. An orderly entered, delivering a telegram to Frank. The room fell silent as he read its contents, his expression darkening. "Is it Korea, sir?" Morrison asked, voicing everyone's concern. Frank folded the telegram carefully. "No, Lieutenant Colonel. It's from Fort Knox General Hospital. My wife has been admitted with pneumonia, condition listed as serious." The news struck like physical force. Catherine, always healthy and resilient, hospitalized with a condition that still claimed lives despite modern medicine. And Frank, thousands of miles away, absorbed in a project that had consumed every waking moment for months. "Sir," Morrison spoke into the stunned silence, "I can oversee the remaining tests. You should go to her." Frank's training and duty warred with personal concern. Thunderbolt stood on the cusp of production approval. His departure now could delay deployment to Korea, where American tankers faced superior enemy armor daily. "Dad," William's voice cut through his father's internal conflict. "Go to Mom. The team can handle this phase. The prototype has proven itself." Frank looked at his son, seeing not just the promising young officer he had become, but Catherine's compassion in his eyes. She had always been the one to remind him of obligations beyond duty, of the human connections that gave meaning to service and sacrifice. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison," Frank said formally, "you will assume temporary command of Project Thunderbolt effective immediately. Complete the testing sequence and prepare the production authorization for my signature upon return." "Yes, sir," Morrison responded. "We'll have everything ready." Frank turned to his son. "Lieutenant Steele, you'll accompany me to Fort Knox. Your mother would want to see you as well." Relief washed over William's face. "Thank you, sir." Arrangements were made quickly. A military transport would fly them to Kentucky that night. Frank briefed Morrison on remaining test protocols and authorization procedures. Harrison and Thompson received specific technical guidance for final evaluations. As Frank packed a small bag in his quarters, Doc Wilson appeared at his door. "Colonel," the veteran sergeant said, "the team wanted you to know we'll make sure everything goes perfectly. You focus on Mrs. Steele." Frank nodded, genuinely moved by the gesture. "Thank you, Doc. I know I'm leaving Thunderbolt in good hands." "Best hands in the Army," Doc confirmed. "And sir, if you don't mind some unsolicited advice from an old sergeant who's seen a few things, go ahead. When you get to that hospital, be a husband first and a colonel second. The Army has plenty of officers, but Mrs. Steele has only one husband." The simple wisdom struck deeper than Frank expected. Throughout his career, he had prioritized duty over family. Catherine had accepted this as part of loving a career soldier, never complaining, always supporting. Now, when she needed him most, he had nearly hesitated out of commitment to a project. "Wise counsel, Sergeant," Frank acknowledged. "I'll remember it." The flight to Kentucky passed in tense silence. William alternated between concern for his mother and reviewing technical specifications for the final testing phase. Frank sat motionless, staring out the window at the darkened landscape below, his thoughts with the woman who had been his anchor through war, and peace. They arrived at Fort Knox past midnight, proceeding directly to the base hospital. The night duty nurse recognized Frank immediately, having served under Catherine's supervision during the war. "Colonel Steele, Lieutenant," she greeted them. "Mrs. Steele has been asking for you. The doctor is with her now. I'll let him know you've arrived." Minutes later, they were ushered into Catherine's room. Frank felt his heart constrict at the sight of his vibrant, capable wife looking pale and diminished against the white hospital sheets. An oxygen mask covered her face, and intravenous tubes ran into her arm. The doctor, a major with tired eyes, summarized her condition. "Bacterial pneumonia, advanced stage. We're administering penicillin and oxygen therapy. The next 24 hours will be critical, but Mrs. Steele has been fighting hard." "Of course she has," Frank said quietly. "She's the strongest person I know." When the doctor departed, Frank moved to Catherine's bedside, taking her hand gently. Her eyes opened, recognition and joy replacing discomfort as she saw her husband and son. She reached up to remove the oxygen mask despite Frank's protest. "You came," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Both of you." Wild horses couldn't have kept us away, William said, moving to her other side. Your project, Catherine managed. Is it finished? Nearly, Frank assured her. But that doesn't matter now. What matters is you getting well. A ghost of Catherine's usual determined smile appeared. Don't patronize me, Colonel. We both know what's at stake with your tank. Even ill, she remained perceptive and direct. It was one of the countless reasons he had loved her for more than 20 years. Thunderbolt will proceed whether I'm at Aberdeen or here, Frank said firmly. My place is with you until you are recovered. Catherine's eyes held his, communicating volumes without words. Then she turned to William. And you, Lieutenant, I expect a full briefing on this wonder weapon you have been creating. William laughed softly. Yes, ma'am, though I think Dad might object to classified disclosures, even to you. I outrank him in this room, Catherine declared with a hint of her usual spirit. The family moment stretched into the early morning hours. Catherine drifted in and out of sleep as the medication took effect. William eventually succumbed to exhaustion in a chair beside her bed. Frank maintained his vigil, holding his wife's hand as monitors beeped steadily in the background. In the quiet darkness, watching Catherine's chest rise and fall with labored breath, Frank confronted emotions he rarely allowed himself to examine. Fear, not for himself but for her. Regret for the countless moments sacrificed to duty. Gratitude for her unwavering support throughout his career. Catherine stirred, her eyes finding his in the dimness. You're thinking too loud, she whispered. I can hear the gears turning from here. Just counting my blessings, he replied softly. Liar, she countered with affection. You're wondering if you made the right decision coming here instead of staying with your project. Frank shook his head in wonder. How do you always know what I'm thinking? 23 years of practice. Her hand tightened on his. You made the right choice, Frank. Not because I needed you here, though I do, but because you needed to remember why that tank you're building matters in the first place. To protect our forces in Korea, Frank answered automatically. No, Catherine corrected gently. To protect families. Every tanker facing Soviet armor has someone waiting for them to come home. Someone who loves them the way I love you. Someone who needs them to return safely. The perspective shift hit Frank with unexpected force. Throughout the Thunderbolt project, he had focused on technical specifications, performance metrics, production timelines. Catherine's simple statement reconnected the mechanical challenge to its human purpose. When did you get so wise, he asked, stroking her hair gently. I've always been the brains of this operation, Colonel, she murmured, her eyes drifting closed again. You just forget sometimes. As Catherine slept, Frank maintained his watch, her words echoing in his mind. Thunderbolt wasn't just a weapon system or a response to Soviet technology. It was a promise to American families that their sons, husbands, and fathers would have the best protection the nation could provide. That perspective would reshape his approach to the project's final phase, whenever he returned to Aberdeen. But for now, his duty lay here, with the woman who had always been his true North Star. Chapter 7, Turning Point. Catherine's condition stabilized by morning, though full recovery would require weeks of treatment and rest. The doctor, encouraged by her response to antibiotics, upgraded her prognosis from serious to guarded. Frank arranged for extended leave from Project Thunderbolt, determined to remain until Catherine could return home. William, however, received urgent recall orders. The final testing phase had revealed unexpected issues with the ammunition feed system under sustained operation. As the designer of several key components, his presence at Aberdeen was essential for resolution. Go, Catherine insisted when he hesitated. I have your father here to pester. Those boys in Korea need Thunderbolt more than I need another hand to hold. Though reluctant, William obeyed his mother's directive. Before departing, he spent a private moment with Frank in the hospital corridor. I'll make sure everything's fixed properly, Dad. No shortcuts, no compromises. Frank clasped his son's shoulder. I know you will. You've proven yourself on this project beyond any expectation. William straightened with pride at the rare paternal approval. I learned from the best, sir. As William departed for the airfield, Frank returned to Catherine's room, settling into what would become his routine for the next 2 weeks. Days spent at her bedside, nights on a cot the hospital staff had provided. He read to her, discussed base gossip, and endured her increasingly pointed questions about Project Thunderbolt. You're worse than any intelligence officer I ever encountered, Frank complained good-naturedly after a particularly persistent interrogation about the tank's capabilities. Just making sure my tax dollars are being well spent, Catherine replied, her voice stronger as her health improved. Besides, it's fun watching you try to explain technical matters without using classified information. These lighter moments alternated with serious discussions about their son. Catherine, with a mother's perception, had noted the positive change in the relationship between father and son. He talks about you differently in his letters now, she observed. With respect, yes, but also understanding. Whatever happened at Aberdeen, you two finally found common ground. Frank considered this. I think we both had to adjust our perspectives. He learned that theory must bend to practical realities. I learned that innovation shouldn't be rejected simply because it's untested. And you both learned you're more alike than different, Catherine added with satisfaction, which I've been telling you for years. Daily updates arrived from Aberdeen via secure telephone calls with Morrison. The ammunition feed issue had been resolved through modifications William and Harrison had collaborated on, setting aside their philosophical differences to find a practical solution. Final testing had resumed, with promising results across all performance parameters. 10 days after Frank's arrival at Fort Knox, the call he had been both expecting and dreading came through. General Abrams himself voiced grave with urgency. Frank, we need you back at Aberdeen. The Pentagon has called a final review board for Thunderbolt. Production authorization hangs in the balance. Catherine is still recovering, Bob, Frank replied, conscious of his wife listening from her hospital bed. Doctor says at least another week before discharge. I understand the personal situation, Abrams said, genuine sympathy in his tone. But this is coming from the Joint Chiefs. The Secretary of Defense will attend personally. Without your authoritative presentation, the project risks significant delays or worse. Frank covered the receiver, meeting Catherine's gaze. Without hesitation, she nodded her permission, mouthing go. When is the review scheduled? Frank asked, resignation in his voice. 48 hours from now. Transport is already arranged from Fort Knox to Aberdeen. After ending the call, Frank sat beside Catherine's bed, conflict evident in his expression. I should stay until you're discharged. Nonsense, Catherine dismissed his concern with a wave. I have excellent care here, and I'm improving daily. Thunderbolt needs you more than I do right now. Nothing needs me more than you do, Frank insisted, taking her hand. Not tanks, not the army, nothing. Catherine's eyes softened. After 23 years, you finally figured that out. Progress, Colonel. She squeezed his hand affectionately. But we both know duty calls, and this particular duty matters tremendously. Those boys in Korea can't wait while I recuperate in a comfortable hospital bed. As always, she cut to the heart of the matter with unfailing clarity. Frank nodded reluctantly. I'll arrange to return as soon as the review board concludes. Don't make promises you can't keep, Catherine cautioned gently. If Thunderbolt receives production approval, you'll be needed to oversee the transition. I understand that, Frank. I've always understood it. The simple statement carried the weight of countless separations throughout their marriage. Deployments, training exercises, temporary duty assignments. Catherine had endured them all with grace and resilience, supporting his career while building her own as a military nurse. When this project concludes, Frank said with sudden decision, I'm requesting reassignment to Fort Knox, teaching position at the Armored School. No more separations. Surprise registered on Catherine's face, followed by cautious hope. You'd be happy with that. No more field commands, no combat deployments. I've had my war, Frank replied. Led men in combat, seen too many die under my command. Perhaps it's time to focus on passing knowledge to the next generation, and on being a better husband than I've managed so far. Catherine's eyes glistened. I've never asked you to change who you are, Frank. You never had to, he said simply. You just had to wait until I figured it out myself. Apparently that takes about 23 years. Her laughter, though still weakened by illness, was the sweetest sound Frank had heard in months. The military transport delivered Frank to Aberdeen the following evening. His core team waited at the airfield, their faces reflecting the tension of the impending review. Welcome back, Colonel, Morrison greeted him. How is Mrs. Steele? Improving steadily, Frank replied, giving orders to the hospital staff like a battlefield commander. Doc Wilson chuckled. Sounds about right. She always could run a field hospital like a general. Status update, Frank requested as they drove toward the facility. Where do we stand? William took the lead, his demeanor professional despite the obvious pleasure at reuniting with his father. Final testing completed yesterday, all systems performed at or above specifications. The ammunition feed issue has been fully resolved through redesign of the autoloader interface. Production readiness, Frank directed this question to Morrison. 3 facilities prepared to begin immediate manufacturing upon authorization. Supply chains established for all critical components. Initial production capacity of 10 units per month, scaling to 25 by third quarter. Frank nodded approval. And the review board? What intelligence do we have on their specific concerns? Harrison answered this question. Primarily cost and timeline justification. The Secretary is reportedly concerned about the expense compared to simply producing more M46 patents. A fair concern from a budgetary perspective, Frank acknowledged, but militarily unsound given what we know about the IS-3's capabilities. They spent the remainder of the evening preparing for the review. Technical specifications were organized, performance data compiled, production estimates refined. Each team member contributed to the comprehensive briefing package that would determine Thunderbolt's fate. Late that night, Frank found himself alone in the testing hangar, studying the production prototype that represented months of intensive effort. The massive tank embodied American engineering excellence, from its revolutionary gun to its advanced targeting systems. If approved, it would give American forces in Korea the capability to counter any armor the Soviets deployed. Footsteps echoed onto the concrete floor as William joined him beside the vehicle. For a moment, father and son stood in contemplative silence, appreciating the culmination of their work. "Do you think they'll approve it?" William asked finally. Frank considered the question carefully. The military case is irrefutable. The IS-3 represents a clear and present threat to our forces in Korea. Thunderbolt provides the necessary counter capability. But military logic doesn't always prevail against political and budgetary considerations. "If they reject it after all this work," William said, frustration evident in his voice, "after all the compromises and accelerated timelines, then we adjust and continue," Frank finished firmly. "That's what soldiers do, Lieutenant. We accomplish the mission regardless of obstacles." William nodded, absorbing the lesson. Then with uncharacteristic hesitation, he asked, "Mom's really improving? You're not just saying that to keep the team focused?" The question revealed the son beneath the officer's exterior. The boy who had always been close to his mother, even while maintaining a respectful distance from his frequently absent father. "She's genuinely recovering," Frank assured him. "Doctor says another week in hospital, then home recuperation. Your mother is tougher than both of us combined." Relief showed plainly on William's face. "Good, that's good." They lapsed into comfortable silence again, each lost in private thoughts about the woman who had shaped their lives in different but equally profound ways. In that moment of shared concern, the remaining barriers between them seemed to dissolve, leaving a deeper understanding than military collaboration alone could have achieved. The review board convened the following morning in Aberdeen's main conference facility. Uniformed officers from various branches filled the room, alongside civilian officials from the Defense Department. At the head of the long table sat the Secretary of Defense himself, flanked by representatives from the Joint Chiefs. Frank presented Thunderbolt's case with the precision and authority of a veteran commander. He detailed the Soviet armor threat, demonstrated Thunderbolt's superior capabilities through performance data, and outlined the production readiness achieved despite the compressed timeline. William and the team provided technical support, answering specialized questions about design elements, manufacturing processes, and combat functionality. Their coordinated presentation reflected the cohesion developed throughout the project. The questioning from board members proved rigorous, but fair. Cost concerns were addressed through detailed production economics. Timeline questions received honest assessments of manufacturing capacity and deployment logistics. Technical inquiries were met with comprehensive engineering explanations. As the review entered its third hour, the Secretary raised the most critical question. "Colonel Steele, given the significant investment required for Thunderbolt production, can you definitively state that this system is essential to our forces in Korea? Could existing tanks with upgraded ammunition not provide sufficient capability at lower cost?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Frank. His response would likely determine Thunderbolt's fate. "Mr. Secretary," Frank began, his voice steady with conviction, "I commanded Sherman tanks against German Panthers and Tigers in Europe. I lost good men because our equipment was outmatched. The M4 Sherman was a reliable, easily produced tank that served admirably throughout World War II. But when facing superior German armor, its limitations cost American lives. Frank paused, ensuring his next words registered with everyone present. We face a similar situation today in Korea. The IS-3 represents a generational advance in tank design. Its frontal armor can defeat any gun currently deployed with our forces. Its 122mm main gun can destroy our tanks before they reach effective firing range. He gestured to the technical display showing Thunderbolt's performance data. This system was developed specifically to address that capability gap. Its 120mm gun, with advanced ammunition, can defeat IS-3 armor at combat ranges. Its own protection can withstand the Soviet 122mm rounds. Most importantly, it can be manufactured and deployed within a time frame relevant to the current conflict. Frank's gaze swept the room, meeting each board member's eyes before settling on the secretary. Sir, I cannot in good conscience recommend sending American tankers into combat against IS-3s without Thunderbolt. The alternative is accepting casualties we have the technological capability to prevent. The secretary studied Frank thoughtfully, then turned to William. Lieutenant Steele, as one of the principal engineers on this project, do you concur with the colonel's assessment? William stood at attention. Completely, Mr. Secretary. I would add that Thunderbolt incorporates technological advances that will influence American tank design for the next decade. The investment delivers both immediate tactical advantage and long-term strategic benefit. The secretary nodded, making notes before addressing the board. I believe we have sufficient information to render a decision. Colonel Steele, please have your team wait outside while we deliberate. The minutes stretched interminably as Frank and his team waited in an adjacent room. Morrison reviewed production contingencies. Harrison and Sarah discussed final technical refinements. Doc Wilson maintained a stoic silence. William paced nervously, the weight of months of work evident in his tense posture. When the call finally came to return, Frank led his team back into the conference room, their expressions composed despite the anxiety each felt. The secretary's face revealed nothing as they resumed their seats. Colonel Steele, gentlemen, and Ms. Thompson, the secretary began formally. After careful consideration of the comprehensive data presented and in light of the current tactical situation in Korea, this board has reached its decision regarding Project Thunderbolt. He paused, scanning the assembled officers before continuing. Production authorization is hereby granted, effective immediately. Initial deployment of 20 units is approved for the Korean theater, with subsequent production subject to combat performance evaluation. Relief swept through Frank's team, though military discipline prevented any overt celebration. Frank himself maintained his professional demeanor as he acknowledged the decision. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, members of the board. We will proceed with production immediately. As the meeting concluded and officials departed, General Abrams approached Frank privately. Congratulations, Frank. Your presentation carried the day. The secretary told me he was particularly impressed by your candor regarding the consequences of deploying inadequate equipment. Just speaking from experience, sir, Frank replied. No commander should have to order men into combat without the best tools we can provide. Well, thanks to you and your team, our tankers in Korea will have exactly that. Abrams clasped Frank's shoulder. Get some rest. Tomorrow the real work begins translating this approval into actual tanks on the battlefield. As the facility emptied of visitors, Frank gathered his core team in their conference room. The professional restraint they had maintained before the review board gave way to genuine celebration. Doc Wilson produced a bottle of bourbon from some mysterious source, pouring modest measures for each team member. A toast, Frank proposed, raising his glass, to Project Thunderbolt and to the American tankers who will soon have the advantage over any armor they face. The team drank to the sentiment, satisfaction evident in their expressions. Months of intensive effort, technical challenges, and political obstacles had culminated in this moment of achievement. As the celebration continued, Frank stepped aside to place a call to Fort Knox Hospital. Catherine answered on the second ring, her voice stronger than when he had left. They approved it, Frank told her without preamble. Production begins immediately. I never doubted it, Catherine replied. Not with you making the case. How's our son? Frank glanced across the room where William stood in animated conversation with Sarah Thompson, his face alight with the pride of accomplishment, growing into an exceptional officer. You'd be proud of him, Kate. I always have been, she said simply, of both my soldiers. The conversation continued briefly, Catherine extracting a promise that Frank would return to Fort Knox as soon as the production transition was complete. After saying goodbye, Frank rejoined his team, observing their interactions with quiet satisfaction. Morrison, ever the responsible executive officer, was already drafting production implementation orders. Harrison and William, once philosophical opponents, now collaborated seamlessly on final technical refinements. Doc Wilson regaled Sarah with improbable tales from tank recovery operations in North Africa. These disparate individuals, thrown together by military necessity, had formed bonds that would endure beyond the project's conclusion. Frank had witnessed this phenomenon before, in combat units forged through shared hardship and common purpose. The crucible of Thunderbolt's development had created similar connections despite the different environment. As the evening concluded, team members departed for well-deserved rest, leaving Frank alone in the conference room. He studied the production authorization document, the culmination of months of effort. Beyond the official language and formal signatures lay a simple truth. American lives would be saved by their work. For a career soldier who had led men in combat, who had written too many condolence letters to families of those lost under his command, this represented the most meaningful accomplishment possible. Not glory or recognition, but the knowledge that fewer telegrams would arrive at American homes bearing the devastating news of sons, husbands, and fathers lost in distant lands. Frank folded the document carefully, placing it in his briefcase. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Thunderbolt transitioned from development to production. But tonight he could rest knowing they had accomplished their mission against formidable odds. In the quiet facility, surrounded by the technical artifacts of their achievement, Frank Steele allowed himself a rare moment of personal satisfaction. Whatever else his military career might include, Thunderbolt would stand as testament to what American ingenuity, determination, and teamwork could accomplish when lives depended on the outcome. And that, more than any medal or commendation, represented a legacy worth leaving. Late spring sunlight gleamed on the polished turrets of Thunderbolt tanks lined in precise formation at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The first production batch of 20 vehicles stood ready for final inspection before shipment to Korea, their massive 100mm guns angled skyward like accusatory fingers pointed at the heavens. Colonel Frank Steele walked the line slowly, inspecting each machine with the critical eye of a man who understood that lives would depend on every weld, every seal, every component. 2 months had passed since production authorization. 2 months of 18-hour days overseeing manufacturing, quality control, crew training. 2 months of Frank dividing his time between Aberdeen and Fort Knox, where Catherine continued her recovery at home after her hospitalization. Her health improved steadily, though more slowly than her independent nature preferred. William had flourished during the production phase, emerging as a natural leader despite his junior rank. Engineers and production specialists alike respected his technical expertise and uncompromising standards. Frank had watched with quiet pride as his son balanced theoretical knowledge with practical application, earning the respect of even the skeptical Harrison. "Final checks complete, Colonel," Morrison reported, approaching with clipboard in hand. "All 20 units meet or exceed specifications. The first 10 ship out tomorrow at 0600. Frank nodded, studying the nearest tank. The Thunderbolt design had evolved from awkward prototype to refined weapon. Its lines now reflected purpose rather than compromise, form following function with deadly elegance. "Crews?" Frank asked. "First training cohort completed certification yesterday. 20 full crews ready to deploy with the vehicles. Second cohort begins tomorrow. And the ammunition production? On schedule. 5,000 rounds of APDS and HESH complete. Another 5,000 in manufacturing." Frank allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction. The project that had begun in desperation now stood on the cusp of deployment. American tankers would soon have a weapon capable of confronting any armor the Soviets deployed to Korea. His promise to the dead of previous wars would be kept. "Colonel," Morrison continued, hesitation evident in his voice, "there's a Pentagon communication you should see. General Abrams sent it by courier an hour ago." Frank accepted the sealed envelope, noting the classified markings. The contents consisted of a single page of text accompanied by a grainy reconnaissance photograph. His expression remained neutral as he read, though those who knew him well might have detected the slight tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes. "Have Lieutenant Steele and Captain Harrison report to my office immediately," Frank instructed, "and locate Ms. Thompson." "Yes, sir. Anything else?" Frank folded the document precisely. "Clear my schedule for the remainder of the day. This takes priority. 20 minutes later, the core technical team assembled in Frank's office. William arrived last, having been supervising ammunition loading tests at the far end of the facility. Sarah Thompson sat beside Harrison, both looking expectantly at Frank. "We've received new intelligence from the Korean front," Frank began without preamble. "Soviet advisors have delivered upgraded armor to Chinese forces near the 38th parallel. The intelligence community has designated it as IS-3M, a modernized variant we haven't encountered previously." He placed the reconnaissance photograph on the desk. The image showed a tank that resembled the standard IS-3, but with notable modifications to the turret and suspension system. "Initial analysis suggests enhanced frontal armor and a new fire control system," Frank continued. "Most concerning is the suspected addition of a reactive armor package not present in previous variants." William leaned forward, studying the photograph. "Reactive armor could reduce the effectiveness of our APDS rounds." "By how much?" Harrison asked. "Difficult to say without testing, but potentially significant." Frank let the implications sink in. Thunderbolt was designed to counter the standard IS-3. If this variant proves substantially more capable, our deployed units could be at a disadvantage. "Options?" Harrison asked, voicing the critical question. "We need data," Frank replied. "Real performance data on this variant's capabilities. Without it, we're guessing about potential countermeasures." Sarah Thompson spoke for the first time. "The ammunition we've developed could potentially be modified to counter reactive armor, but we'd need specific information on its composition and arrangement." Frank nodded agreement. "General Abrams has proposed a solution. A technical intelligence team will deploy to Korea with the first Thunderbolt shipment. Their mission, capture performance data on the IS-3M, and if possible, obtain samples of the reactive armor for analysis." The room fell silent as the implications became clear. This wouldn't be a safe rear echelon assignment. It would require operating near or at the front lines, where the new Soviet tanks were being deployed. "I've been asked to lead the team," Frank continued, "given my familiarity with Thunderbolt's capabilities and limitations." William's head jerked up, surprise evident in his expression. "You're going to Korea, sir?" "Yes, and I'm selecting key technical personnel to accompany me." Frank's gaze moved deliberately to Harrison. "Captain, your gunnery expertise will be essential for analyzing the enemy's fire control systems." Harrison straightened. "Of course, sir. Ms. Thompson will need your metallurgical analysis capabilities. The reactive armor composition will determine our countermeasures." The civilian engineer nodded gravely. "I understand, Colonel." Frank turned lastly to his son. "Lieutenant Steele, you'll remain at Aberdeen overseeing continued production and training. As remaining senior technical officer, you'll be responsible for implementing any modifications we determine necessary based on field data." William's expression flickered with conflicting emotions before settling into professional neutrality. "Yes, sir." As Harrison and Thompson departed to prepare for the assignment, William remained behind, tension evident in his posture. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Frank nodded once. "I should be on that team." William's words carried conviction rather than petulance. "I designed key components of Thunderbolt's targeting and ammunition systems. If modifications are needed based on field observations, having the designer on site would expedite implementation." Frank considered his son carefully. The argument was sound from a technical perspective. In another circumstance, with another officer, he might have agreed immediately. But this was his son, and the mission carried genuine risk. "Your expertise is precisely why you need to remain here," Frank replied. "If something happens to the field team, you are the only one who fully understands Thunderbolt's integrated systems." William's jaw tightened in a manner remarkably similar to his father's. "With respect, sir, that's not the real reason." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Explain, Lieutenant." "You're keeping me here because I'm your son." The words hung in the air between them. "You're protecting me while placing yourself at risk." The accusation struck uncomfortably close to truth. Frank had indeed weighed his personal relationship with William when making the assignment, though not in the simple way his son suggested. Family relationship was a consideration, Frank acknowledged, but not in the way you think. This mission requires clear command authority. Having father and son on the same high-risk assignment creates potential complications. That didn't stop you from having me on Project Thunderbolt. Development at Aberdeen isn't combat deployment to Korea. William paced the small office, frustration evident in his movements. "You taught me that duty comes before personal considerations, that a soldier goes where he's needed, regardless of risk. Yet now you're making decisions based on our relationship rather than mission requirements." Frank felt a complex mixture of pride and concern at his son's argument. William was right in part. The division of assignments wasn't based solely on technical considerations, but the reasoning went deeper than simple paternal protection. William, Frank said quietly, using his son's first name rather than rank, there's another factor. Your mother nearly died 2 months ago. She's still recovering. If something happened to both of us in Korea, understanding dawned in William's expression. Mom, he said simply. Frank nodded. She's never asked either of us to avoid danger. Never tried to hold us back from duty. But losing both husband and son simultaneously would destroy her, William finished the thought. One of us needs to come home to her. That's not sentiment. That's responsibility to family, which is also part of being a soldier. The tension drained from William's posture as he absorbed his father's reasoning. I understand, sir. I know you do. Frank allowed a hint of approval to show. Your eagerness to take on the riskier assignment speaks well of you as an officer. But in this case, the wiser course is division of risk. William nodded reluctantly. When do you deploy? 48 hours, just enough time to brief the team and prepare technical equipment. Frank hesitated, then added, I'll need to see your mother before departure. Explain the assignment. She won't like it, William observed. No, but she'll understand it's necessary. Frank gathered the intelligence documents, returning them to their classified folder. I'll be flying to Fort Knox tonight, returning tomorrow evening. I'm counting on you to prepare the technical equipment packages with Thompson and Harrison. Yes, sir. William saluted formally, then hesitated at the door. Dad, be careful over there. The simple statement, laden with filial concern rather than military protocol, touched Frank more deeply than he cared to admit. Always am, Lieutenant, always am. That evening found Frank on the porch of their Fort Knox home, Catherine beside him in a rocking chair, as sunset painted the Kentucky sky in shades of amber and gold. He had broken the news of his Korean deployment as gently as possible, emphasizing the technical rather than combat nature of the assignment. She had listened in silence, her expression revealing little beyond thoughtful attention. How long? She asked finally. 60 days initially, potentially longer depending on what we discover about the new Soviet armor. Catherine nodded slowly, absorbing the information with the pragmatism of a career military spouse. And William remains at Aberdeen overseeing production and training. He'll implement any modifications we determine necessary based on field observations. A knowing smile crossed Catherine's features. He argued to go instead of you, didn't he? Frank chuckled softly. He did, made a compelling case too. Of course he did. He's as stubborn as his father. Her hand found his, fingers intertwining with practiced familiarity. You're keeping one steel safe at home. For you, Frank acknowledged, you've given enough to the Army these past months. Catherine's grip tightened. I'm stronger than you think, Colonel. I know exactly how strong you are. Frank brought her hand to his lips, a rare public display of affection, which is why I know you'll understand this mission is necessary. American lives depend on Thunderbolt performing as designed against the newest Soviet armor. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered around them, each lost in private thoughts. Catherine had endured deployments throughout their marriage, had sent her husband into danger repeatedly over 23 years together. This assignment, while not combat designated, carried its own risks operating near the front lines in an active war zone. Promise me something, Catherine said finally, if I can. Come home in one piece. Her voice carried the weight of countless separations, reunions, fears conquered and realized. I've gotten rather attached to having you around these past months. Frank smiled into the gathering darkness. I'll do my very best. And Frank, Catherine continued, her tone shifting subtly, while you're gone, I want you to consider something. What's that? When this is over, when Thunderbolt is fully deployed and proven effective, consider retirement. She held up a hand forestalling his automatic response. Not immediately, after an appropriate transition, but you've given 40 years to the Army. Perhaps it's time to give a few to us. The suggestion wasn't entirely unexpected. Frank had been contemplating a similar course since Catherine's illness, though he hadn't yet voiced the thoughts to anyone. His active duty career had spanned 2 wars, countless deployments, achievements recognized with rows of ribbons and medals. What remained to prove? I'll consider it, he promised. Seriously. Catherine nodded, satisfied. That's all I ask. The night deepened around them, fireflies appearing like floating embers in the yard beyond the porch. Whatever dangers Korea might hold, this moment of peace with the woman who had anchored his life for decades seemed to Frank more precious than any military accomplishment. Tomorrow would bring preparation for deployment, technical briefings, equipment checks. Tonight belonged to Catherine and the home they had built together through years of separation and reunion. Frank Steele, career soldier, allowed himself to imagine for the first time what life beyond the Army might hold. Chapter 9. Thunder in Korea. The transport plane descended through cloud layers above Gimpo Airfield near Seoul, banking sharply before lining up with the runway. Frank Steele gazed through the small window at the Korean landscape below. Hills rose in the distance, still scarred from years of warfare. Closer to the airfield, military encampments sprawled across the terrain, a city of tents, vehicles, and temporary structures housing the international force assembled under United Nations command. Beside him, Captain Harrison reviewed technical specifications on a clipboard, seemingly oblivious to the bumpy descent. Sarah Thompson occupied a seat across the narrow aisle, her civilian status evident only in subtle details of her attire. Despite lacking military rank, she had adapted seamlessly to the mission requirements, organizing her metallurgical equipment with precision that would impress any quartermaster. The plane touched down with a jarring impact, tires screeching on concrete as the pilot fought crosswinds. Within minutes, they were deplaning onto Korean soil, greeted by the distinctive smell of aviation fuel mixed with dust and the faint odor of kimchi from nearby food vendors. A jeep waited on the tarmac, a young lieutenant standing at attention beside it. He saluted crisply as Frank approached. "Colonel Steele? Lieutenant Parker, sir. I've been assigned as your liaison officer during your deployment. General Harding sends his compliments and requests your presence at command headquarters as soon as you're settled." Frank returned the salute. "Thank you, Lieutenant. We'll need transportation for our technical equipment as well." "Already arranged, sir. Truck following shortly." Parker gestured toward the jeep. "If you and your team would accompany me, I'll escort you to your quarters first. The general has scheduled your briefing for 1600 hours." The drive from Gimpo to the base complex took them through the outskirts of Seoul, though the front lines had long since moved north. Evidence of earlier fighting remained in pockmarked buildings and makeshift repairs. Civilians went about their business with the resilience of people accustomed to living under the shadow of conflict. Markets bustling despite proximity to a war still technically ongoing. Their assigned quarters proved surprisingly comfortable, a concession to the technical nature of their mission rather than Frank's rank. Two connected Quonset huts had been modified to provide both living space and a small laboratory area where Sarah could conduct materials analysis. "Impressive setup," Harrison commented as they inspected the facilities. "Someone takes our mission seriously." "General Harding," Parker explained. "He's been pushing for more technical intelligence on the new Soviet armor. Lost 3 tanks to them last month in a probing action near the DMZ." Frank's attention sharpened. "Any captured wreckage?" "No, sir. Chinese recovery teams extracted all 3 vehicles before our forces could secure the area. That's why your mission is considered high priority." After settling their equipment and changing into fresh uniforms, Frank and Harrison accompanied Parker to divisional headquarters, leaving Sarah to organize her laboratory equipment. The command center occupied a former school building, its classrooms converted to offices and operations centers. Maps covered walls, marked with unit positions and suspected enemy concentrations along the 38th parallel. General Richard Harding, commander of the 2nd Infantry Division, greeted them in a conference room already occupied by several staff officers. In his mid-50s with silver hair cropped close to his scalp, Harding projected the confident authority of a commander who had risen through combat leadership rather than staff appointments. "Colonel Steele," he extended his hand, "your reputation precedes you. Your work on the Thunderbolt project is well known here." "Thank you, General. May I present Captain Harrison, our gunnery and fire control specialist." Pleasantries exchanged, they settled around a large table where reconnaissance photographs and intelligence reports lay organized in precise folders. Harding wasted no time on preliminaries. "Gentlemen, we've been engaged in what amounts to a technical chess match with Soviet advisors since this conflict began. They introduce new equipment, we counter. We deploy new capabilities. They adapt. For most of the war, we've maintained at least parity, often superiority, in armored engagement capability." He tapped a folder marked with top secret designations. That changed 3 months ago when the Chinese received their first shipments of what we now classify as IS-3M tanks, modified Soviet heavies with enhanced armor protection and fire control systems. We've lost 8 tanks in 3 separate engagements with these vehicles. zero enemy losses. Frank studied the reconnaissance photographs, noting differences between the standard IS-3 he was familiar with and this new variant. The turret shape showed subtle modifications, likely accommodating improved optics. The hull featured additional armored sections that appeared to be modular rather than integrated into the main structure. Reactive armor panels, Harrison observed, pointing to the box-like structures, similar to what the Soviets have been developing for their domestic units. Our assessment as well, Harding confirmed. The real question is composition and effectiveness. Our standard ammunition appears significantly degraded against these panels. Frank examined the combat reports, noting penetration failures even at close engagement ranges. Your first Thunderbolt units arrive tomorrow. Have you selected crews? Yes, veteran tankers, all with combat experience. They've been training on simulators for the past month. Real question is, will Thunderbolt fare better against these modified IS-3s than our current tanks? That's what we're here to determine, Frank replied. But to do so effectively, we need more than reconnaissance photographs. We need direct observation data, ideally captured components for analysis. Harding's expression turned grimly satisfied. Precisely why I requested your team. I've been authorized to assign you to a special reconnaissance element operating near the DMZ. Their mission is technical intelligence gathering rather than direct combat engagement. When do we deploy forward? 48 hours. Your Thunderbolts arrive tomorrow morning. I want your team to oversee final preparation and initial crew familiarization before you move to the observation post. Lieutenant Parker will remain your liaison and guide. The meeting continued with detailed intelligence briefings on Chinese armor deployments and suspected operating areas of the modified IS-3s. By the time they returned to their quarters, dusk had settled over the base. The distant sound of artillery fire, a reminder that the war remained very much active, despite the official designation as a conflict. Sarah had transformed their small laboratory space into a functional analysis center, equipment unpacked and arranged with methodical precision. She looked up from calibrating a portable spectrometer as Frank and Harrison entered. How bad is it? She asked directly. 8 tanks lost, 0 enemy casualties, Harrison replied, summarizing the situation succinctly. Reactive armor panels are defeating our standard ammunition. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. I suspected as much from the preliminary reports. Without samples to analyze, I can't determine exact composition, but Soviet metallurgical research has focused heavily on layered composites in recent years. We deploy to a forward observation post in 48 hours, Frank informed her. Thunderbolt arrives tomorrow. We'll oversee final preparations and crew familiarization before moving up. Will I have access to the forward areas? Sarah asked. The question gave Frank pause. As a civilian specialist, Sarah wasn't technically bound by military deployment restrictions. Yet the risks of forward observation posts were substantial. The observation post is 5 miles behind the line of contact, he said finally. Still within artillery range, but not in direct fire engagement zones. Your expertise will be essential if we recover any armor samples. Are you comfortable with that level of risk? Sarah's expression remained professionally neutral. Colonel, I didn't come to Korea expecting laboratory safety standards. If material samples are recovered, I need to analyze them immediately, not wait for transport to rear areas. Field modification of ammunition may be necessary based on findings. Her pragmatic assessment confirmed Frank's initial impression of the civilian engineer. Technical expertise combined with practical understanding of mission requirements made her an invaluable team member, regardless of military status. Very well, Frank agreed, but you'll follow security protocols exactly. No unnecessary risks. The following morning dawned clear and cool, perfect conditions for the arrival of the first Thunderbolt shipment. Frank and his team positioned themselves at the railhead, where the tanks would arrive after transport from the port facility at Incheon. Around them, maintenance crews and the selected tank commanders waited with barely concealed excitement. These men had fought the war in vehicles increasingly outmatched by enemy armor. Thunderbolt represented the technological advantage they had been promised for months. The distinctive rumble of diesel engines announced the arrival of the transport train. 10 massive flat cars, each bearing a single Thunderbolt tank secured with heavy chains. As the train ground to a halt, Frank felt a surge of pride. From concept to Korean soil in less than a year, American industry and engineering at their finest. The offloading process began immediately, specialized crews releasing securing chains and guiding each tank down reinforced ramps to the assembly area. Frank moved among the vehicles, conducting personal inspections despite the exhaustive checks that had been performed before shipment. These machines represented more than military hardware. They embodied months of intensive development, technical challenges overcome, and ultimately, American lives saved through superior protection and firepower. Harrison supervised engine startups and systems checks, while Frank briefed the assembled tank commanders. These men, veterans of earlier engagements against Chinese and North Korean forces, regarded the new vehicles with the measured optimism of soldiers who had seen promising equipment fail under combat conditions. Gentlemen, Frank addressed them directly, Thunderbolt was designed specifically to counter the heaviest Soviet armor. Its 120-meter gun can penetrate any tank currently in the Chinese inventory at combat ranges. Its targeting system enables accurate first-round hits even while moving. But it remains a machine, operated by men. Your skill and judgment will determine its effectiveness in combat. Questions followed, practical inquiries about maintenance requirements, ammunition storage, and combat tactics. Frank answered each with the authority of a developer and the understanding of a former tank commander. By midday, the first crews had begun familiarization exercises, maneuvering their assigned vehicles through basic drills under Harrison's watchful supervision. That evening, Frank composed a brief message to Aberdeen, reporting successful arrival and initial deployment preparations. The technical details would mean little to most readers, but William would understand the subtext. The tanks had arrived intact. Initial crew response was positive. Systems performed as designed under initial testing. He added a personal note for Catherine, kept deliberately casual to avoid triggering security concerns. All well, weather pleasant, quarters comfortable, simple phrases that would reassure without revealing operational details. Lieutenant Parker appeared as Frank completed his message. Colonel General Harding requests your presence. Intelligence update regarding our mission. The urgency in Parker's tone alerted Frank immediately. Now? Yes, sir, vehicle waiting. 20 minutes later, Frank sat with Harding and his intelligence officer in a secure briefing room. Maps displayed on the wall showed recent troop movements along the DMZ with special attention to Chinese armor concentrations. We've intercepted communications indicating a planned offensive within the week, Harding explained without preamble. Chinese armor units, including the modified IS-3s, are consolidating just north of Sector 7. He indicated a bulge in the line where UN forces held a salient extending into North Korean territory. The observation post where we plan to deploy your team is here, the intelligence officer continued, pointing to a position 3 miles behind the salient. If Chinese forces break through, that position would be quickly overrun. Frank studied the map, assessing options. Alternative observation positions? Here and here, the officer indicated 2 locations on the map. Both offer observation capabilities, but at greater distances. Effectiveness for technical intelligence gathering would be reduced. Harding leaned forward. Colonel, I've modified our original plan. Rather than passive observation, I'm proposing a limited offensive operation designed to engage the modified IS-3s directly with your Thunderbolt units. A controlled confrontation under circumstances we select rather than waiting for their attack. The proposal represented a significant departure from their original mission parameters. Direct engagement carried substantially higher risks but offered the potential for immediate comparative data on Thunderbolt versus the modified Soviet tanks. Crews aren't fully trained on the new systems, Frank pointed out. Recommended certification requires minimum 2 weeks of progressive exercises. Understood, Harding acknowledged, but these are experienced combat tankers. They've already demonstrated remarkable adaptation to the new vehicles. And frankly, Colonel, we're out of time. If the Chinese offensive succeeds, we lose the initiative entirely. Frank considered the situation from multiple perspectives. As technical advisor, he should recommend against deploying uncertified crews and untested vehicles. As a military officer, he recognized the strategic necessity Harding described. The contradiction represented a familiar dilemma in warfare. Perfect solutions rarely aligned with battlefield realities. What's your proposed operation? Frank asked finally. Relief showed briefly on Harding's face before his professional mask returned. Limited armored thrust here. He indicated a narrow valley leading toward Chinese positions. 4 Thunderbolts with infantry support. Objective is to provoke response from their heavy armor units, engage briefly to assess comparative capabilities, then withdraw under artillery cover. We anticipate they'll commit their IS-3Ms to counter what they'll perceive as a probing attack. Casualties? Harding met his gaze directly. Possible. But facing these modified tanks in defensive positions during their planned offensive would likely result in more losses. This way, we control engagement parameters. Frank nodded slowly. I'll need to participate directly. Observing from a distance won't provide the technical assessment data we require. I anticipated that request, Harding replied. You'll accompany the force commander in the lead vehicle. Captain Harrison will position with our artillery observers to assess fire control effectiveness. Ms. Thompson will remain at the forward aid station to analyze any recovered materials immediately. When? Tomorrow at 0500. Pre-dawn advance to minimize observation. We expect to make contact approximately 0630. Frank spent the remainder of the evening with Harrison, selecting the four most promising Thunderbolt crews for the operation. These men had demonstrated exceptional aptitude during the day's familiarization exercises, adapting quickly to the new vehicle's capabilities. They would receive intensive briefing on the modified IS-3s and specific engagement tactics before deployment. Sarah joined them later, after Harding's staff had delivered the latest intelligence on Soviet reactive armor. Without physical samples, her analysis remained theoretical, but her expertise allowed reasonable predictions about effectiveness and potential vulnerabilities. If it's standard Soviet ERA, she explained, referencing explosive reactive armor, the panels contain sheets of explosives sandwiched between metal plates. When struck by a penetrator, the explosive detonates, disrupting the incoming round before it can penetrate the main armor. Countermeasures? Harrison asked. Multiple hits in the same location can overwhelm the system. The first round triggers the reactive element. Subsequent rounds face only the base armor. Alternatively, tandem warheads with a precursor charge to trigger the reactive element, followed by the main penetrator. Frank considered this information. Our current ammunition isn't designed for either approach. We'll need to adapt tactics rather than technology for this engagement. Sleep came fitfully that night, Frank's mind cycling through tactical scenarios and potential outcomes. The operation represented a calculated risk, deploying unproven equipment with partially trained crews against a superior enemy force. Yet the alternative, allowing Chinese forces to initiate offensive operations without understanding their armor capabilities, carried even greater dangers. Before dawn, Frank joined the assault force at the staging area. 4 Thunderbolt tanks idled in formation, their massive silhouettes barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Infantry units mounted in armored personnel carriers completed the task force, a compact but potent combat element designed for rapid advance and, if necessary, equally rapid withdrawal. Major Robert Jenkins, the task force commander, greeted Frank with professional courtesy tinged with curiosity. Colonel Steele, heard you design these beasts. Hope they perform as advertised. They will, Major, assuming crews follow engagement protocols. Jenkins nodded. Briefed them personally last night after your captain's presentation. They understand the mission parameters. Technical assessment, not decisive engagement. Frank climbed aboard the lead Thunderbolt, settling into the commander's position behind the gunner. Though years had passed since he had commanded a tank in combat, the familiar confines of a turret brought muscle memories flooding back. Different configuration, more advanced systems, but the essence remained unchanged. A steel box carrying men and weapons into harm's way. At precisely 500, the task force moved out, advancing through UN lines toward the salient. Dawn revealed rolling hills covered with sparse vegetation, ideal terrain for armored operations. Frank maintained radio silence, observing the Thunderbolt's performance as they navigated the difficult terrain. The suspension systems handled elevation changes smoothly, the modified Patton chassis demonstrating stability even at increased speed. By 0615, they had reached their first objective, a ridgeline overlooking a shallow valley where intelligence suggested Chinese armor units conducted daily movement exercises. Jenkins deployed his force in textbook formation, Thunderbolts in hull-down positions along the ridge, infantry securing the flanks, artillery observers calling in pre-registered coordinates for potential fire support. Now we wait, Jenkins commented, scanning the valley through binoculars. If pattern holds, they'll move armor units into the open within 30 minutes. Frank checked his watch, conscious that every minute increased the risk of detection. The morning mist would provide concealment for perhaps another hour, after which their position would become increasingly vulnerable to observation. Movement, the gunner reported suddenly, bearing 045, multiple tracked vehicles. Frank shifted position, using his own binoculars to observe. Through the thinning mist, the unmistakable silhouettes of Chinese armor appeared, conducting what appeared to be routine deployment exercises. T-54s primarily, Soviet-designed medium tanks that comprise the bulk of Chinese armored forces. No heavies yet, Jenkins noted. They typically deploy after the initial elements establish perimeter security. 10 minutes passed as they observed the Chinese deployment. Then, as predicted, larger silhouettes appeared from concealed positions behind a distant tree line. IS-3As, their distinctive pike nose hulls unmistakable even at distance. There they are, Frank said quietly. Modified turrets, reactive armor panels visible on hull front and sides. Jenkins nodded, then spoke into his radio. All elements prepare to advance. Fire mission on pre-registered coordinates on my command. The task force moved with synchronized precision, emerging from concealment to advance down the gentle slope toward the valley floor. Immediately, the Chinese forces reacted, vehicles turning to face the unexpected threat. Commanders visible in turret hatches as they assessed the situation. They've spotted us, the driver reported unnecessarily as dust clouds rose from the Chinese positions. Continue advance, Jenkins ordered. Steady pace. Let's get positive identification on those heavies before they withdraw. Frank focused his attention on the IS-3s, now clearly visible through his binoculars. The modifications matched intelligence assessments, but seeing them in operation provided critical details photographs couldn't capture. Movement patterns, deployment formation, crew reaction times. Range to target? Jenkins asked his gunner. 2,000 meters, sir. Extreme range for effective fire. Hold position here, Jenkins ordered, halting the advance while still safely beyond effective enemy fire range. All units maintain current position, observe and report. Through his binoculars, Frank watched the Chinese reaction unfold. Rather than retreating, their armor units were deploying into offensive formation. The IS-3s, initially held in reserve, now advanced to forward positions. Their 122mm guns clearly intended as the primary response to the UN incursion. They're committing their heavies, Frank observed, exactly as hoped. Jenkins nodded grimly. Now comes the test. If those modified IS-3s advance to engagement range, we'll see what Thunderbolt can really do. The Chinese advance continued methodically, their armor spreading across the valley floor in textbook Soviet doctrine. The IS-3s remained centered in the formation, protected by lighter tanks on the flanks. Range gradually decreased as they closed the distance. 1,700 meters, the gunner reported, within our effective range but still beyond theirs. Jenkins keyed his radio. All Thunderbolt units, select APDS ammunition. Target as 3 variants only. Fire on my command. Frank felt the familiar tension of impending combat, the crystalline focus that eliminated all considerations beyond the immediate tactical situation. These moments had defined his wartime experience, the convergence of training, technology, and human decision under the ultimate pressure of survival. Range 1,500 meters, the gunner announced. Target acquired. IS-3 variant, bearing 035. Fire, Jenkins commanded. The Thunderbolt's massive 120 mesh roared, the concussion reverberating through the turret despite sound dampening systems. Through his binoculars, Frank tracked the round to impact, watching as it struck the lead S-3 squarely on its frontal armor. Smoke and debris erupted from the impact point, temporarily obscuring the target. As it cleared, Frank observed the results with professional detachment. The round had struck a reactive armor panel, detonating its protective charge as designed. The Thunderbolt's projectile had been disrupted before penetrating the main armor. No penetration, he reported. Reactive armor functioned as expected. Before Jenkins could order a second round, the Chinese tanks returned fire. Their 122mm guns, though firing from greater range than optimal, sent shells screaming toward the UN position. Most fell short or wide, but one round impacted near the third Thunderbolt, showering it with debris without causing significant damage. All units, fire at will, Jenkins ordered. Concentrate fire on designated targets. The 4 Thunderbolts began a synchronized fire pattern, each selecting an IS-3 and delivering precisely aimed rounds at 15-second intervals. Frank observed the impacts through his binoculars, noting penetration effects in target reactions. The second round from their tank struck the same IS-3, impacting just beside the location of the first hit. Without reactive protection at that specific point, the APDS round penetrated the base armor, visible confirmation as smoke began pouring from the turret. Penetration confirmed, Frank noted with professional satisfaction. Crew abandoning vehicle. Similar scenes played out across the valley as the Thunderbolts demonstrated their superior fire control and penetration capabilities. Two more IS-3s suffered critical hits, their crews escaping from hatches as internal fires consumed the vehicles. The fourth reversed behind a low ridge, using terrain for protection against the devastating 120-millimeter fire. Chinese forces beginning general withdrawal, the gunner reported. Medium armor providing cover for remaining heavies. Jenkins checked his watch. We've achieved our objective. Technical assessment of engagement capabilities confirmed. Recommend withdrawal before they organize artillery response. Frank nodded agreement. Concur, we've gathered sufficient data for initial assessment. As the task force began its planned withdrawal, Chinese artillery opened fire on their position. The first rounds fell well behind their location, but adjustment would soon bring effective fire. Accelerate withdrawal, Jenkins ordered. All units, maximum speed to rally point Alpha. The Thunderbolts reversed up the slope they had descended earlier, their powerful engines handling the incline with ease. Frank maintained observation of the valley, watching as Chinese recovery vehicles approached the disabled IS-3s. Their efficiency suggested well-rehearsed procedures for retrieving damaged equipment. Any chance of capturing one of those vehicles? Jenkins asked, following Frank's gaze. Not without committing substantially more forces, Frank replied. And the intelligence value wouldn't justify the casualties. Within 30 minutes, the task force had reached friendly lines. Mission accomplished with 0 personnel casualties and no equipment losses. A textbook operation that had provided critical technical intelligence on both the modified Soviet tanks and Thunderbolt's combat effectiveness. At the debriefing that afternoon, Frank presented his preliminary analysis to General Harding and his staff. The engagement had confirmed both the threat posed by the modified IS-3s and the countermeasures effective against them. Reactive armor provides significant protection against single impacts, Frank explained, but second hits at the same location defeat the system. Thunderbolt's superior fire control accuracy makes this tactic viable in combat conditions. Harding nodded with satisfaction. An overall assessment of Thunderbolt performance? Exceptional, Frank replied honestly. The 4 vehicles engaged functioned exactly as designed. Accurate first-round fire at ranges exceeding enemy capabilities. Mobility and protection superior to existing inventory. Crew feedback universally positive despite limited training time. Modifications required based on observations? Minor adjustments to fire control algorithms to account for the reactive armor characteristics. No hardware changes necessary. Captain Harrison is already implementing the software updates for the remaining vehicles. As the briefing concluded, Harding approached Frank privately. Impressive work, Colonel. Both the vehicle design and your tactical assessment. Washington will be pleased. Thank you, General. Though the real test will come when Chinese forces launch their expected offensive. About that, Harding's expression turned thoughtful. Intelligence now suggests they're reconsidering their timeline after this morning's engagement. Apparently, losing 3 of their most advanced tanks to weapons they hadn't anticipated has caused some strategic reassessment. The implications satisfied Frank more than any formal commendation. Thunderbolt had already achieved its primary purpose, deterring enemy action through demonstrated technological superiority. American tankers would face the battlefield with equipment matched to the threat, their lives protected by the engineering excellence his team had delivered. That evening, Frank composed detailed technical reports for transmission to Aberdeen. William would understand the significance of this successful engagement, the validation of their months of intensive development work. More importantly, he would recognize that the project they had struggled through together had saved lives already and would continue to do so throughout the conflict. As Frank finished his reports, Lieutenant Parker appeared with a telegram. Priority message from Aberdeen, sir. Frank opened the envelope, expecting technical queries based on his initial reports. Instead, the brief message carried personal rather than professional news. Mother suffered relapse, condition serious but stable. Returning to Fort Knox to assist. Will continue oversight of production remotely. William. The words struck Frank with physical force. Catherine, who had seemed well on the road to recovery when he departed, now hospitalized again. William demonstrating both filial devotion and professional responsibility by arranging remote project management from Kentucky. For the first time since arriving in Korea, Frank felt the full weight of separation from his family. His presence here had proven valuable, perhaps essential to Thunderbolt's successful combat implementation. Yet Catherine's condition represented an equally valid claim on his attention. The conflict between duty and family, always present throughout his military career, had never seemed more starkly defined. In earlier years, the choice would have been automatic. Duty first, always. The mission above personal considerations. But now, with retirement a serious consideration and his son demonstrating exceptional professional capability, alternatives existed that would have been unthinkable before. Frank picked up the field telephone, requesting a secure connection to General Harding's headquarters. The decision forming in his mind ran counter to decades of professional conditioning, yet felt right in ways that transcended military protocol. When the connection completed, he spoke with uncharacteristic directness. "General, I need to discuss an adjustment to our technical advisory mission parameters. Personal circumstances require my attention stateside." Chapter 10, Full Circle. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Fort Knox General Hospital, painting Catherine's room in warm golden light. Frank Steele sat beside her bed, his uniform replaced by civilian attire, his posture relaxed rather than military rigid. 3 days had passed since his emergency return from Korea. 3 days of doctors, treatments, and gradual improvement in his wife's condition. The pneumonia had returned with unexpected virulence, compromising already weakened lungs and requiring aggressive intervention. Now stabilized, Catherine remained weaker than anyone would prefer, her normally vibrant presence diminished by illness and medication. "You shouldn't have come back," she chided gently, though her eyes revealed gratitude belying the words. "Your mission wasn't complete." Frank shook his head. The critical phases were, Harrison can oversee the remaining technical implementation. Some things are more important than perfect mission completion. The admission would have been unthinkable months earlier. The transformation from duty-obsessed officer to balanced husband had been gradual, accelerated by Catherine's first hospitalization, and cemented by his experiences with William during Project Thunderbolt. "Besides," he continued, "our son was performing admirably, managing production while handling your medical situation simultaneously. Proves he doesn't need my constant oversight." Catherine smiled weakly. "He's been exceptional, practically living here between remote conferences with Aberdeen. The nurses have adopted him as an honorary staff member." As if summoned by their conversation, William appeared in the doorway, his uniform showing signs of hasty preparation, dark circles beneath his eyes testifying to insufficient sleep. Despite his obvious fatigue, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that had developed throughout the Thunderbolt project. "Morning report from Aberdeen," he announced, entering with a folder. "All production targets met. 6 more units shipping to Korea next week. Harrison reports the software modifications you recommended have been implemented across all deployed vehicles." Frank accepted the folder, scanning its contents briefly before setting it aside. "Excellent work, though perhaps you should focus more on sleep and less on hourly updates." William grinned tiredly. Sound advice from a man famous for working 20-hour days during development. "Do as I say, not as I've done," Frank replied with uncharacteristic lightness. "A benefit of age is recognizing one's past mistakes." Catherine watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction, her eyes moving between husband and son. Whatever friction had existed between them had transformed into mutual respect and comfortable familiarity that transcended their military relationship. "Have you told him yet?" she asked Frank. William looked up. "Told me what?" Frank hesitated, the decision still feeling somewhat unreal, despite the paperwork already filed. "I've submitted retirement papers, effective 6 months from now, after Thunderbolt transitions to full operational status." Surprise registered on William's FIDEMU, followed by understanding. "Because of Mom's condition?" "Partly," Frank acknowledged, "but primarily because it's time. 40 years of service is enough for any soldier, and Thunderbolt represents an appropriate capstone to my career." "What will you do?" William asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Your mother and I have discussed options. The Armor School has offered a civilian advisory position, technical consultant rather than active instructor, flexible hours, no deployments." "He might actually learn what weekends are for," Catherine interjected with a hint of her usual spirit. William nodded thoughtfully. "It suits you, passing knowledge to the next generation of officers without the constraints of active duty. And perhaps more time for other pursuits," Frank added. "Your mother has maintained a list of postponed activities for decades. Apparently retirement means addressing them systematically." Catherine's laugh, though weaker than normal, carried genuine amusement. 30 years of "we'll do that when there's time." "Well, Colonel, time has arrived." Their conversation continued, moving from retirement plans to William's career prospects. His performance on Project Thunderbolt had not gone unnoticed by senior commanders. Promotion seemed likely, along with increased responsibility in armor development programs. As they talked, Frank found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. From the Berlin Victory Parade, where he had first encountered Soviet heavy tanks, through the development crucible of Project Thunderbolt, to Catherine's illness and his emergency return from Korea. A series of events that individually seemed disconnected but collectively had transformed his perspective on duty, family, and legacy. The ultimate measure of a military career, he had come to realize, wasn't found in ribbons, rank, or even specific achievements. It lay in the lives saved through one's efforts, the knowledge passed to subsequent generations, and the family sustained despite the demands of service. 3 weeks later, with Catherine recovering at home under the watchful care of a retired Army nurse, Frank received the communication he had been anticipating from Korea. General Harding's report detailed the first major engagement between Thunderbolt-equipped units and Chinese armor forces, including the modified IS-3s. The battle had unfolded almost exactly as their test engagement had suggested. Thunderbolt's superior range, accuracy, and penetration capabilities had proven decisive. 8 enemy tanks destroyed, including 5 IS-3 variants, with only 1 Thunderbolt damaged and 0 crew fatalities. Included with the official report was a personal note from Harrison. "Your design worked exactly as intended, sir. The Chinese attempted their offensive with confidence in their heavy armor advantage. That confidence lasted approximately 8 minutes into the engagement. Tactical withdrawal became full retreat under Thunderbolt's fire. Modification algorithms performing as predicted. Jenkins sends his regards and thanks for the finest tank he's ever commanded." Frank shared the report with William that evening on the porch of their Kentucky home. Catherine had retired early, her strength still building gradually, leaving father and son to discuss professional matters privately. 8-to-1 exchange ratio, William noted with professional satisfaction. "Even better than our design projections." Frank nodded, watching fireflies appear in the gathering dusk. "The true measure is crew survival. 0 fatalities despite direct engagement with superior enemy numbers." "That was always your primary design consideration," William acknowledged. "Protection and survivability over raw firepower." "Experience shapes perspective," Frank replied. "Having commanded men in combat, having lost crews to enemy fire, it changes how you approach weapon design." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in private thoughts. Finally, William spoke again, his tone reflective rather than professional. "Do you ever regret it? The years given to service rather than family?" The question would have seemed presumptuous months ago. Now it represented the natural evolution of their relationship beyond the constraints of rank and military protocol. "Regret isn't the right word," Frank answered carefully. "I accepted the requirements of service knowingly, made choices consciously. But I recognize now that perfect balance was possible, and I often defaulted to duty at the expense of family." He looked at his son directly. "You have an opportunity to approach your career differently, to recognize from the beginning that excellence in service doesn't require sacrificing personal connections. That's a lesson it took me decades to learn." William considered this advice thoughtfully. "The project changed both of us, didn't it?" "For the better, I think," Frank agreed. "You gained practical perspective to complement your theoretical knowledge. I rediscovered the importance of innovation and family connection." The project that had begun as a response to Soviet armor had evolved into something far more significant for both men. Beyond the technical achievements, beyond the lives saved in distant Korea, Thunderbolt had forged a connection between father and son that transcended their military relationship. As darkness settled over Fort Knox, Frank Steele contemplated the legacy he would leave upon retirement. Not just a revolutionary tank design or commendations in his personnel file, but a son who had become both an exceptional officer and a balanced human being. A wife whose patience and support had sustained him through decades of service. A future that held possibilities beyond uniform and rank. The thunder of his wartime service would eventually fade into history. The steel of his military bearing would gradually soften with age. But the connections forged through shared purpose and mutual respect would endure, a legacy more meaningful than any weapon system or battlefield victory. In the quiet Kentucky evening, with retirement papers filed and his son beside him, Colonel Frank "Thunder" Steele found himself at peace with both past and future. The mission that had defined his final active duty assignment had been accomplished. The greater mission of family and legacy stretched before him, a new deployment worthy of his full commitment.